So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Gail Henderson. I'm the Community Development Director for the county. And today we're going to be talking about climate change and how it can be incorporated into the comprehensive plan update that we're working on. And luckily for you, I'm not the one doing this. This is Christine Shirley. She is the Climate Change Resilience Coordinator with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. If you have not picked up a worksheet yet, that's on the table. We're going to be working through that later today. And just a few housekeeping things. We do have sign-in sheets, so we're trying to track how many people we reach out to and how many people are attending the meetings. There's also our way to get your contact info if you want to be notified of upcoming meetings. So if you have not signed in, please do so before you leave. Restrooms are straight back. Men's are on the right, ladies are on the left, and coffee and food is available on there. There's also a water fountain in the back. If the coffee is too strong, it's completely my fault. I like strong coffee, and I so having said all that, I just want to welcome Christine Shirley. Thank you.
I'm really happy to be here and see such a great turnout. It's really wonderful. So I work for Conservation and Development. For the last 14 years, well, 13 years, I worked in the Natural Hazards Center. And last year, the LCD started an initiative to examine climate change with respect to the statewide land use plan goals, and also to update this document called the Oregon Framework for Adaptation. So I'm working on that, and it's an effort that involves 23 different state agencies, and it's meant for our internally, for our state agencies to get their house in order with respect to how we address climate change and climate adaptation. So I've been working on that for a year, so it's kind of a fresh project, I guess you could say. That's fine. There we go. That's me, and my contact information is up there, and if any of you have follow-on questions after this meeting, I'm happy to take calls and emails. All right, so what I want to do today is just do a very brief introduction to the climate change, not from the perspective that you may see all the time, which is it's going to get warmer, but there are a whole bunch of follow-on effects of climate change, and that's one of the things I want to explore with you all today. So after I do my brief introduction, I'm hoping that we can do an interactive sort of brainstorming, creative thinking exercise where we think about those follow-on consequences of climate change. And then when we finish that, we'll move into brainstorming about how we might address those impacts through the comprehensive plan. And so I want to keep you focused, if I can, on the comprehensive plan. As you probably know, climate change will touch almost everything you do, and we could spend days having that conversation. So in the 3 hours we have this morning, I'd like us to focus on the comprehensive plan. So that's my goal for the morning. Any questions, concerns? Okay, so before I get started, I just want to point out that there are many resources available to help you learn more about climate change, and I know it can be totally overwhelming. I do this all the time, and I get overwhelmed a lot. So don't feel bad if it's overwhelming, because it really is, and it's a situation where we're looking into an unknown future, and that can be a little disconcerting. Just by way of background with respect to that, most of our planning efforts and our engineering, the sizing of culverts, and so on, bridges, size of bridges, how we manage our environment is based on looking back into the past record, looking at the statistics, and figuring out how to maintain what we have in a productive way. We can't do that anymore. we are in a world where we can't look back to plan our future activities. And that's it's a brave new world. It's a world that a lot of professionals are struggling with how to address. So don't feel bad if you get sort of confused and anxious, because that's, everyone is. So, all right, so the top row of reports there come from an organization called the Oregon Climate Change Resilience Institute, which is our Oregon climatology group, I guess. And they do reports every year that summarize what they know about climate change. And these documents are available online from OCRI, the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. And there's a place where you can explore data called the Northwest Climate Toolbox, climatetoolbox.org. That's a place where you can really get confused if you start digging into all the data. But it is there for you to explore. And one thing I wanted to mention that you are kind of lucky to have here is the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center recently completed a study of sea level rise for the state of Washington. But luckily, they also included the Columbia River estuary and most of Clatsop County. So that study is also available, and it's really cutting edge, good science. So I urge you to look at that as well. That one is it's at the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and it's a sea level rise study that they just completed in 2018. And it also has maps and lots of data. So those are some resources. But we don't have time to go into the big details. Oh, this is what I wanted to show you from the Northwest Climate Center, or excuse me, from this recent study. This is a map of what the state of Washington studied, and you can see down there in the corner there is Clatsop County. So, all right. All right, so we all know that temperatures have been going up, and I think we can agree that that is a result of the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So we can very clearly see the signals. Actually, the temperatures have been going up for quite a long time. It's just that we haven't been sort of advertising it. But if you can see on this chart that the trend has been going up pretty much since the 70s. And it will continue to go up unless we reduce our emission of greenhouse gases. And even if we do completely eliminate the emission of greenhouse gases, which is impossible, but if we drastically reduce them, we will still see the effects of climate change for many years, because the residence time of these gases is in the order of 100 years. So we have a big challenge in front of us, not only to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but also to respond to the consequences of the concentrations we already have in the atmosphere. And yeah, so does anyone have any questions about that sort of, this is sort of the basis of the triangle here. Yes?
My only frustration is I'm trying to write as fast as I can write. And
Yes.
I get these websites down, and is there someplace where we can get them?
Well, I can leave these slides behind, and
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, I put a few of them on the handout, but I can't remember if I got all of them on there. Okay, yes.
You know, we often see charts like this. But
Yes.
going along with this, it's just as important, and maybe even more so, is the acidification of the oceans. And it'd be nice if once in a while at these presentations, if that information would be brought out and attention drawn to how that's going to affect us.
Yes, you're right. Another big driver of change is the acidification of the ocean. And in fact, my next slide. Okay, I apologize for how small the writing is, and it's also kind of faded out, I guess is the word. What I'm trying to depict with this diagram, and I'm going to walk through this, is that it's the changing atmospheric temperature increase and ocean acidification, hypoxia, that is driving a whole bunch of other effects. So we start from there, from the center of the diagram, and the ocean acidification and air temperature increases cause things like changes in hydrology, how much it rains or not. When those rains come, do they dump all in the winter now and none in the summer, or vice versa? Here it's mostly heavier winter rains. It could result in drought as the climate circulation patterns change and the jet streams change and all that as a result of increased air temperature. Yes?
Is there any way to figure in the impact of plastics in the ocean?
Well, that's not really a climate change thing. So, but
I wonder if there's an interaction.
you do bring up a really good point, though. The effects that we see resulting from climate change are also affected by other stressors, such as population growth, plastics in the ocean, and endocrine disruptors that disrupt the hormones of animals. So yeah, there are a lot of stressors on the environment. Climate change is only one of them. And they interact with each other, which makes it really complex.
Just
Yes.
as a follow-up to that, even though you're exactly right, like climate change and plastic in the ocean are two totally separate things. However, the process to create plastics, which requires fossil fuels, which contributes to all of that, in a way, actually, now.
That's true. The manufacture of plastics does emit greenhouse gases. Lots of them, as a matter of fact. Okay, so anyway, these temperature changes and the changing chemistry and temperature of the ocean cause changes in, like I said, the hydrology, air quality, extreme heat events, hypoxia, which is the oxygen deprivation in the ocean waters and estuaries. What else is on there? Wildfire. And I want to talk a little bit about wildfire here because I think it's kind of a sleeper issue in this county, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. So anyway, those things in the yellow circle are sort of the first order changes that we read a lot about in the literature. But then, because of those things in the yellow circle, we have other changes like flooding, erosion and landslides, changes to our air quality as a result of wildfire, and ground level pollution as a result of hot days. And all those things cause other follow-on consequences, such as disease vectors, changes in water quality, changes in our biodiversity, changes in our forest composition. So this chart is by no means complete, okay? But it's up there to illustrate that the changing temperatures of the air and the changing chemistry of the ocean have a lot of follow-on consequences that we need to be aware of and respond to. So by and large, we don't have a lot of control over how these changes unfold unless we reduce our emission of greenhouse gases. Okay? So one of the challenges in updating your comprehensive plan is to figure out where you have the opportunities to respond to these changes in a way that doesn't destroy your economy and environment. And that's kind of what we're about with the adaptation side of things. On the greenhouse gas mitigation side, which is the reduction of greenhouse gases, we have to think about how we might change our practices so that we emit fewer greenhouse gases. So there's two sort of separate parts of the problem. And then there's a third part, which doesn't really get very much airplay, but should, which is carbon sequestration. And that plays a big role in forested ecosystems. So how we manage our forests in Oregon can play a role in ensuring that carbon is not released into the atmosphere, but is sequestered in the natural carbon cycle. All right. Yes. Yes.
How the word economy is almost a throwaway, that it's very hard to stop and think about, well, what isn't a good economy? You know, and it's extremely hard to get anyone to even contemplate a contracting economy as a good economy.
Right, so the economy is complex. Who benefits, who pays is a big deal. And do we continue on our growth economy trajectory, or do we learn how to have what I call a satiation economy, where it's a circular economy, where things are traded amongst ourselves, but we don't keep growing? Yeah. So those are important considerations.
Even just to address that oxymoron and have sustainable growth.
Yes. So did everyone hear that? That it's kind of oxymoron to have sustainable growth? Yeah. Okay, so I might have to pass this microphone around so people can hear. So, yeah. Question over here.
Hello, my name is Susanna Gladwin, and I have forest lands, and I've been trying to get the county to incorporate under acceptable forest practices of use practices is carbon capture. I could foresee under the Forest Practices Act that they may mandate some age of a tree growth cutting. I think it's very important.
Yeah, carbon capture is a strategy we need to consider. Okay, so do you all feel like you have sort of enough of a grounding where we are now to go into the worksheets, or do you want some more background? More background? All right, so do you have a specific area of confusion or a gap that you?
Implications of climate change on a coast, for instance,
Specifically on our coast. Okay, so in the worksheet, there are two parts to the worksheet. One is I went through those resources that I put up on the screen, and I listed out some of the implications that come both from these follow-on consequences and from other things. I listed out how I think it might affect Clatsop County. So that might help get us started. I can bring up a copy of the worksheet. This is my last slide. Yes. So what I'm going to do while you're getting copies of these worksheets is bring them up on the screen so we can work through them together. And what I did, are you going to do that? So what I did was I looked at each of the statewide land use planning goals, and I took the consequences from that diagram and I lumped them into some big categories. So it's in the presentations folder, or PowerPoints, I guess, and it's a Word document. No, yeah, there it is. So I lumped them into some categories that are specific to this area. And those categories are increased air temperature, summer drought, stream flow changes, increased storminess, which includes heavy precipitation and wind, sea level rise, ocean temperature and chemistry, and other effects that we may identify through this conversation. Okay, so as I mentioned before, what we have to keep in mind through all of these is that what we know about the past may not apply to the future. Yes?
My understanding from previous meetings is that there could be up to 1 billion people that have to leave where they currently live.
Yes.
To migrate to areas where it is still livable. And
Yes.
I believe we have one of those areas that will still be livable. So we could see an influx of refugees to our area. Is that?
Yes, that's a consequence that's actually in the worksheet. You'll see it later. But climate migrants is definitely something that we need to think about in Oregon, because our climate will become more favorable relative to other places in the United States and indeed the world. So yeah, it's something we need to think about. Yes?
When you talk about population, I think you're referring to permanent population. The tourism industry is predicated on population that is temporary by definition, and that is more and more of an impact on every aspect of life here.
Yes, I'm very glad you brought that up, because the literature that I have seen about population pressures in this area almost never talk about tourism. And I think that's a gap that we need to pay attention to. Yep. And especially on the coast here, where the difference between permanent population and tourist population and second homes and primary residences is huge. So yeah, it's something we need to pay attention to.
And it's bleeding into the winter time too. It's not.
Yes, that is something else that we're finding as a consequence to climate change, is that the shoulder seasons are now primary tourist seasons. Our Parks Department is finding this in their daily operations now, that people are using the parks much more frequently in the springtime and the late summer, early fall, and winter too, yeah. So, yes?
I'm just going through the worksheet. I love it. Thank you so much. So practical. I'm Nadia Gardner, Planning Commissioner.
Mhm.
So I so appreciate that you asked those 3 questions. How do we, number 1, respond to the changes? Number 2, reduce emissions, and 3, increase our carbon sequestration, which of course our county has huge potential for that third one.
Right.
Then I noticed the worksheet is just for the first.
Well, the worksheet is a little bit light on the mitigation side, partly because I have been focused for the last year on adaptation, and I kind of have this gap in my thinking. So as we go through the worksheet, let's think about those mitigation opportunities as well. But yes, I appreciate
It's
the
almost like
comment.
it needs at least another 1 or 2 columns. But I just say it because I feel like in all of our planning, that's what we're doing, we're just responding rather than talking about our part in at least mitigating. Of course, we're not going to stop it, but at least being a part of the solution. And so,
Right.
just like as a group, maybe think about that along the way. That's great.
Okay, yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Gail, is someone taking notes for this?
We're recording.
We're recording it so I can go back later and, great. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of go through these goals very quickly and just brainstorm things that you don't see there that you wish were there, addressed in each of these categories. And so I take your point that more emphasis on mitigation would be a good thing. Okay, so in the citizen involvement realm, one of the things we're finding with respect to climate change effects and mitigation is that the actions we take affect our populations differently. And we can no longer lump citizens, residents in one group and say, well, I've done outreach to my residents here in Clatsop County and therefore I'm done. We're finding that we have to target our messages to the people who are affected in different ways. So that's one of the things I noticed in the citizen involvement part of your comp plan is that it does kind of lump residents, or they call them citizens, because that's what the goal says, in one group. And as we move forward into this brave new world, we're going to have to think about what we ask of people to do to mitigate for greenhouse gas emissions and respond to the effects of climate change, how that affects our different populations differently. So age, income, ability to speak English language well, how remote you are situated relative to the urbanized areas, that kind of thing. So any thoughts about other citizen involvement challenges that climate change might bring about? Yes.
So unfortunately, in this particular area, even the acceptance of climate change is not universal.
Yes.
And that, unfortunately, as part of the timber unity movement, getting out this idea that climate change is a hoax is kind of a core to their message.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've seen big, I'm from Columbia County, we had a forum there where they had a couple of climate deniers, and there was like 100 people showed up, and they bought up the line and sinker. So I think in terms of citizen involvement, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting out to the public, educating them to the point where they accept climate change as a reality.
Yes, and I agree, but this is such a complex issue to explain that it's going to take some good social science to figure out how to explain it well, which I don't think we're doing very well at the moment. Yes.
Question, since we are kind of like brainstorming.
Yes.
This could go towards not only the response part of it, but the mitigation part of it too.
Mhm.
So you bring up a very good point. This is something I have struggled with myself as a state representative in trying to explain the science to people in a way that they can understand. Because for me, all of these things are great that we figure out how to respond to, but if you can't accept the underlying reason why this is happening, it makes responding that much harder.
Right.
So in terms of this citizen involvement, this first thing that we can do to try to help get people involved in all of these things, maybe more educational opportunities like what we're going through right now. That presentation that you had that was very high level,
Mhm.
I think could be very helpful to a lot of people. So I think that's one suggestion for maybe put under citizen involvement, more outreach opportunities. than
Right.
Talk about the science.
Right. Yes.
I didn't introduce myself before, pardon me, I'm Leanne Thompson, I'm the District 5 Commissioner of the southern half of the county.
Okay.
Which is from the ocean to the Columbia County line and Tillamook County line and Shawty.
Okay.
And what I hear is a little different than what you heard in Columbia County. I hear people accepting that there are changes and terrified of the economic impact of dealing with those changes on themselves as individuals and families and on communities.
Yes.
And so really for me, the common ground that we need to look for is not just reaching out to people, but really being willing to listen to their concerns. Because it takes a while to get down through the absolute terror of bankruptcy and homelessness and
Right.
poverty and all of the things that people are terrified about having an impact. I mean, they see the danger. This is what I hear. Maybe I'm too optimistic. They see the danger from climate change. They see the impacts. But when they're faced with the economic implications, they falter because they don't hear leadership as concerned as they want them to be about the impacts.
Yes. Agreed. Good point.
Also, in the future, citizen involvement will probably become more of a thing. I think with climate change, more people will probably be coming to more meetings and be more concerned.
More people. Yep.
So I think it's incumbent then on the process to articulate a way to expect more people and to expect the philosophical sides to maintain their positions, which they will, and to find those concentric rings. You know, where do those Venn diagrams cross for the things that are actionable items that we don't necessarily need to have purity on at one level, but can still make progress sort of at another level. So I think
Mhm.
more citizen involvement is coming, and a way to sort of identify things we can agree on to move forward, the good versus maybe the very good, the excellent being the
Progress at purity.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take a question in the back, and then I'll get to you. Okay.
Follow the money. Tesla stock is over $500, and the solar stocks are climbing. That's evidence of people who want to make all kinds of things happen.
Right. So we have to grab onto that. Yes, question here.
Actually, I just wanted to join on to what Leanne said. I think that this terror that you were describing, I think that requires a real strong element of vulnerability, of people being willing to say, like, this is what I'm terrified of, this is what I'm afraid of. And because collectively that willingness to be vulnerable in that way isn't there, I think it's a lot easier for, the anger and all of these other things to come out and say, climate change isn't real, we're not gonna deal with this. But if we could get to that place, if we could get to the place where we're being compassionate with each other's vulnerabilities, maybe this conversation can turn the corner.
That's a really interesting and deep point, because part of that allowing people to be vulnerable is that they trust the leadership to listen and take the concerns to heart.
Something that has shifted and that is positive in media's coverage of different events. I remember after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people were saying, like, oh, this is likely linked to climate change. And now when things like Harvey or the Australian wildfires happen, we can say, this is an effect of climate change. Like, we need to stop equivocating, and I think that is already happening. Unfortunately, it has to reach this point where the flooding is happening in Iowa or whatever. There's all these horrible disasters happening where we, before we're willing to say that, okay, this is not a maybe, this is happening right now.
Right, unfortunately true. Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then I want to move on to the land use planning stuff. So yes.
Okay, my thought on bringing people around to accepting reality is to take as much time talking about the opportunities that are presented to the changes that are coming. The loss of forestry jobs, which is really happening through mechanization more than through environmentalists getting their way and stopping clear cutting. Just take a look at the land. It's just as many trees are being cut as ever, in fact more, but by fewer people. So stress what can be done, what the future is in changing our energy source. There can be all kinds of jobs possible for solar installations, designing solar systems, designing other alternative energy systems. Those are great opportunities. There'll be plenty of jobs. People aren't going to be poverty stricken by this. They'll be wealthier if they find solutions than if they dig in and just keep clear cutting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Recognizing the opportunities that are before us is really important, and it's something we're concentrating on in our climate change adaptation framework that they're doing at state agency level. But yes, you're right. There are opportunities as well as challenges ahead. And then there's a question back here.
I just wanted to comment as a local educator, work with high school students, and also doing a public lecture series right now for the community called Building for Sustainability. And in my experience, when you're trying to teach about climate change directly, that works very well with middle school students and high school students. They get it, and they can kind of share back their minds about the future of what it's going to be like in the future. When you're working with adults, what I found is the people that will come to an event like this are generally speaking already on board. So you're just kind of preaching to the choir, but not really reaching a new audience. The way to reach a new audience is by basically just talking about money. This is going to save you money, this is going to make you money, something like that. That's money, something that everybody can understand. And you can really kind of just vary all the time arguments and environmental arguments, just say, here's a way to save money and make more money. So if we're going to focus on kind of citizen education, that would not be my recommendation. Focus on high school students in terms of the actual science, and focus on kind of money and economics in terms of the field.
Yeah, find what's driving people to make decisions. Yes.
So
Yeah.
I agree with you, and I think that one of the nuts and bolts things we need to think about is a lot of our systems, even for public participation, are set up in a particular way and involve a certain group of people. All of us have a flexibility in our lives. whether it's being retired or having vacation time or money to just be here, right?
Right.
And high school students are in high school, and poor people have jobs that they can't get away from.
Yep.
And if we're going to open this citizen involvement up to the greater number of people that Pat is talking about, we need to adapt these systems for education and involvement to be more flexible and inclusive of all those other people that could be here but can't.
That's absolutely true, and that's one of the policies I hope that you will develop in the next, when we get to the next part of the worksheet. That's exactly right. Oh, okay, we talked too long. Okay, so I want to move on to the next goal, which is land use planning. And it was already brought up once before that our land use planning program is based largely on projected population growth over a 20-year period. And those population growth estimates, by and large, look at the past trends and project into the future. So one of the challenges I see is that our population projection methodology may not be adequate to the task. The other thing that I identified is that we have an urban growth boundary system that tries to keep development in compact as possible, but we may find that some of those urban growth boundaries will become inundated by water, storm surge, become wildfire issues, landslide issues. So we're going to have to think about how we modify or use the urban growth boundary system so that we stay out of those hazardous areas. Now, this has become a challenge at DLCD. The urban growth boundary system is based on, like I said, keeping development compact and not having these fingers of development go out into the forests and farms, but when we confront these hazard issues, we have some real issues to confront. So those are two of the things I came up with as challenges with the land use program that you possibly could address through your comp plan. Any other ones you can think of?
I was just going to say the population increase that's already happening.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the map, Oregon was pretty good.
Yes.
So we will continue having an influx.
Particularly on the coast. Yeah. Yes, question. Yeah.
As somebody who's gone to probably too many planning meetings, I think more than what can planning in its terminology can do. And also as somebody has lived in Jewel out in the country for almost 50 years, as to population. And a couple of things. There is in Jewel, there was a high population. My property had 400 men living on it, if you want to live in bunkhouses and things like that, and cut wood. And the houses that existed 50 years ago, I'm not talking about bunkhouses, regular single-family homes, who knows how many? My guess is 3 times as many as now. And it brings to water and sewage, and I would like to have, I don't know if it's in there, but for gray water systems, for sewer systems that are more like porta potties that don't use water, or somehow a very minimum of water, and then don't demand so much water into houses, because then it comes to water, and the water use won't, the way state water laws are, it makes it very difficult with seasonal water to meet all the requirements for enough water for that much development. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Yes, water's a good point, and we're going to talk about that, but I do appreciate the idea that we need to think about bringing new technologies into our public works world. Yes.
I'd just like to address your comment about a series of risks that the urban growth boundary should consider. That's something that as a part of the advisory committee, we have touched a little bit upon creating a series of overlays that can be used to help guide any potential increase in the urban growth boundaries. At least, and also to have some kind of built-in flexibility as more information, more accurate information comes along that could easily be incorporated into the comprehensive plan. Have it built in so that it's more of a living document rather than static for, say, 40 years.
Yeah, that brings up another challenge that we have at DLCD, and I've, working with other cities, have come to learn, is that our state laws, I'm not going to say required, it's a little bit less than required, clear and objective standards. So we can't just arbitrarily say that this area is hazardous, you need to stay out of it. You need to identify those areas ahead of time and then have policies and regulations in place ahead of time. And that is a challenge when the world is changing really fast. So that's something else that we can talk about with respect to the land use planning program. I'm going to go back here and then here.
Thanks. Something I would just suggest adding to the sea level rise section is relocation of current neighborhoods that are likely to become inundated in the future. So a lot of projections are showing that large areas of Warrenton, the Mill Pond neighborhood, a lot of these neighborhoods that were originally backfill or wetlands are going to be underwater. So obviously we're going to have to do something about that.
Yep, that's in one of my policy suggestions that we'll see later.
All of my age peers are irritated at not having more grandchildren. Their children have absolutely zero desire to have any kids at all. Japan seemed in a happy position of worrying about population decrease. There are other places in the world, I can't rattle them off, that view that as a problem where they have to import people to do jobs. I think we need to at least put that on the list of puzzlements that our old expectations from Portland State University, how does that match up with, why is it that all my smart friends are frustrated?
Yep, that's very true. Our population trajectories are not going to be the same for at least the foreseeable future. We need to take that into account. There was another question over here.
One of the things that I think about for land use planning, maybe it might fall on that, is we don't have dedicated sections for mitigation or sequestration. As far as if we need purpose-driven lots of land that are for those uses, I don't know where else they necessarily fit in our planning process.
That is a wonderful suggestion, to actually have zoning or special area plans for sequestration and mitigation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with someone from DLCD at a conference recently, explaining the fact that the county is already planning ahead for relocation of county resources, things like that. And she said, well, and I said, shouldn't we be thinking about putting something in state law which makes it easier, especially for municipalities, to relocate facilities out of hazardous places? And she said, well, it's an exception. You just come in for an exception. Well, I'm a land use planner. Put my kids through college, by exceptions, etc. So it seems to me that since this is going to happen, probably all over the state, it would be very useful to have there be some kind of an expedited process for some of these imminent things that we're facing without going through the exception process.
Yes, absolutely. A good example of that, if you may remember the flooding in Vernonia. and their urban growth boundary was shaped like a horseshoe, and the part that was out of the horseshoe was on top of the hill, and that was where they wanted to put their school. We had to go through a very tedious and lengthy process to get that urban growth boundary changed when it should have been a lot easier. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so lots of good ideas on that land use planning side of things. Are we ready to move on to agricultural lands?
One more on land planning.
Uh-huh.
I just think about what you're talking about it being on the coast and with regard to the statewide plans. I mean, the 7 coastal counties are the only counties that have the ocean. And so if we're looking for exceptions, fast tracking kind of thing, especially with regard to relocating public services out of flooding, which is climate driven, possibly,
Right.
of course, I'm a tsunami guy. So if we also have that part of it, we can't do it here for those reasons. It's something we probably can't do. So if we need to kind of push the envelope on that, I think the coast, sort of fortunately and unfortunately, has some good arguments for those kind of exceptions.
Right, maybe not, let's not call them exceptions, but maybe there's a different streamlining, that's a good word. Yes, yes. All right, so, yes.
I just wanted to make a comment that the fabric of our whole society is on rule following to some extent, and so if we aren't careful in how we plan for this, potential, all these different impacts, we could see that fabric start to break down as desperation levels rise. How much are people going to care about zoning or, what it might be?
Right, exactly. That's why I prefer the word, I would prefer to not use an exception process, but some streamlining process. Yep. Okay, I'm going to take a question back here. Do you want to, yeah. Remember, we're talking about consequences of climate change on our land use planning.
So this is a mix of that and agriculture. I thought we were on to,
We can do agriculture.
but this is both. In that in dealing with any population increases, I'm very familiar with zoning of acreage, and I'm not sure how far of the county this is true, but you can only have a lot that's either a F80, meaning only forest uses, or a 5-acre lot. So that, and I've asked the county for more information on cluster development. I think it might be an easy window, especially slightly expedited if we wanted to do cluster development, and then to define lands. That's if you have 5 acres, one acre has a house, and the rest, I would say, lay fallow, do something, and then that's very carefully defined and well written in that those lands have to be held for agriculture or forestry uses. I think that got it. Thank you. Just to maybe change the zoning. I mean, I'm in counties looking at changing that zoning thing, where you can either have one house on 80 or one house on 5, and it's very self-determined. I mean, county.
Right, so that's a conversation the county can have, but there are some rules about that at the state level that we have to be aware of as well.
So I just wanted a clarification just on where things go. So, so under land use planning, so some of these can kind of go through the entire document. So drinking water, I think, is a huge one, both quality and quantity, and then fire risk. And so would drinking water be in this goal, or would it be, a natural hazards goal, and fire risk, would that be in this goal, or would it, so I'm just.
It's in there somewhere. I can't remember exactly what it was.
Yeah.
Drinking water, I put it in
Public facilities, because, most, well, I wouldn't say most, I don't know. So a lot of our people are on wells, right? So we have municipal systems, but a huge number of people, and very poor people especially, are, out in the hinterlands with a very vulnerable water source. And then fire risk, of course, being up against a lot of forest land. I live in Arch Cape. We've almost burned down twice in the last 5 years. So, does that go here? Does that go in natural? I just feel like if it gets stuck in natural hazards, it's sort of like these should be in each one of these goals that are appropriate. And then my last one was about aquaculture. So, just attending the last Ocean Policy Advisory Council meeting, there's a huge interest in expanded aquaculture in Oregon because we're, quote unquote, so behind other states. And so, I think that should go under agriculture possibly, but definitely under ocean temperature and chemistry and like how that all fits in. So just.
Yeah, good comments, and it brings up that circle diagram that I tried to show. Everything is interconnected, which makes this such a tough problem. So, all right, so the things I came up with for agriculture, the challenges, not so much the policy response, is that as our water hydrology changes and we get more winter runoff and less summer runoff, we may find that our regulators say, well, you have to leave water in the stream for the fish, and therefore we can't irrigate anymore in this area, which was brought up back here. So that's a challenge. It's potential. Can you think of any others with respect to agriculture?
I'd add to that, because this is a fairly wet area, at least on the coast, a lot of people do agriculture with minimal irrigation.
Mm-hmm.
So as the temperature does rise, even just a slight amount during the summer, many people that do agriculture will probably find a need that they are going to have to develop irrigation systems.
Mm-hmm. So
And
new irrigation.
So it'd be new irrigation.
Right.
And the other thing is that under increased storminess, that could have a big effect on agriculture. We hear about it all the time in the Midwest where somebody's crop gets wiped out.
Right.
Because of heavy rain or a hailstorm or a windstorm, things like that.
Right.
That's going to begin to affect agriculture more if it really comes to fruition. Another item is on sea level rise. Much of our farmland is down in the lowlands, and there are tide gates involved in some cases to make the land available for various agricultural uses. So those tide gates will be affected by rising sea levels. So
Right.
we need to adjust those in different ways. Also, the higher sea level, even though it will be fairly slight here for a number of years, will bring in higher salinities into the estuary, which will feed into Young's Bay, which will reduce the opportunity of people to pump directly from the Young's Bay water source. It's already fairly saline, but it will become more saline farther upstream and just reduce available supply.
Mm-hmm.
And then on your under other effects, I almost think there should be a column for biological response, which isn't quite in the same league, the same tier of things that you have for your main headings across the top of your chart. But,
Right.
But it plays into so many of these things. And so for agriculture, it isn't just health. It's the movement of all sorts of organisms, from microscopic ones in terms of what a lot of people would refer to as pests. I refer to them as competing organisms to the
Yeah.
agriculture. And those could be anything from rodents that get at crops or eat at the trees in the forest land as well. The infestations that we get in our vegetation that keep the vegetation from growing as well.
Right.
So those are the things that I would add to that. There's a whole lot of potential effects to agriculture from the changes.
Yeah, yeah. Now keep in mind, I don't want to shut down the conversation, but this is really important stuff. But keep in mind that what we're talking about is how the comp plan can be changed to address some of these challenges. So it's really good to bring up the challenges, and then we can think about the comp plan changes, but we may not be able to address it through the comprehensive planning program. So, but I take your point to add a column about biology.
Thank you. And I
continue with that, one of those effects that we have to think about in agricultural lands is our already decreasing population of pollinators, and that's going to continue to erode, and the bees are becoming a threatened and endangered species, and there are many other pollinators as well. So we have to think about ways, and a lot of our local forestry groups and partners are working on pollinators, and there are pollinator programs, and so that's something we need to consider in our planning too going forward.
Very good. Did I see a hand over here? Okay.
Does the comp plan give out subsidies for things? Is that part of this, or no?
They can't give out subsidies if you say that the county will work on it.
Okay, because just one thought I have in this is maybe subsidies for maritime agriculture, such as growing seaweed and bivalves underwater. If we can shift some of the burden into the underwater lands around here, we kind of reduce some of the burden on the regular agriculture land.
I'm looking around for people that haven't spoken. Does anyone who hasn't spoken for a while have something they want to say? Okay.
The solutions we generate tend to stem from the language that we use to describe the problem.
Yes.
I have a pet interest in agroforestry. This is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Center for Agroforestry. I find anytime I think in those terms, I bump into turf wars of forestry versus agriculture, which is how things are phrased in working typically. That there is no need to think agroforestry because we cover both of those separately.
Yeah. I take your point there. Agroforestry and forestry and recreational forests, and they're treated differently, but they're the same piece of land. So it's kind of hard to, yeah, we're wrestling with that in our adaptation plan as well.
So our current agricultural system is a global system, and it's based on fossil fuels. We import and we export, and so I think when we look at agriculture, we're going to have to think about, okay, like if everyone else's in the whole world's systems are affected in even more drastic ways than the ways ours are affected, how is that going to change the amount we want to export versus the amount we want to import? Yeah. And so when we're looking at, into the future, is there, are we wanting to keep more of our agricultural local, or, given that maybe there's not going to be a source of cheap bananas anymore, or whatever it might be?
I hope we don't have to grow bananas here. That would be bad. But I do take your point that we have to balance our internal needs for local less carbon emitting agricultural trade with the opportunities to feed into a global market. So, yeah. If I caught that right.
I'm not sure how or where this fits in, but I think underlying this is this sense that we know that an earthquake and tsunami is coming, and we are not going to be able to depend on other areas to help us or sustain us for a while. Right. And so I'm just wondering, when I struggle with the comp plan work, often what is there in terms of the state planning law, we don't know how to have an impact on that because, things have changed so much since somehow rules were written that it doesn't allow for the nuances, and we don't know how, we are told, well, yeah, you feel this, and yeah, you're probably right on this, but you can't put that in plan because the state doesn't cover it. How do we get through that?
I don't know the answer to that, but I understand the problem. Yes, we wrestle with that. Yeah. All right, so, yes.
Especially since our state representative is in the room. Jan, I'd like, we can affect state laws relating to land use planning. I think that recent legislatures have not had a great interest in addressing it, and that's probably our fault, that we haven't brought things forward that need to be changed in state law. And with all of the concentration now on the 100-year water vision and on climate change, it might be time for us to go back to the state and say, you know, guys, we might need some tweaking going on here. And so I think that's on us, you know, that we kind of have to come forward and do that and rattle our representatives.
Let's get together and rewrite.
So, well, and you see, I can handle our representative because she's the only person who's the same size I am. And so we can duke it out pretty effectively without hurting anybody's.
Along those same lines, I don't understand, I'm Maria Pinsetta, I'm part of the CAC in North Plains. What I'm trying to grog with is, to your point about business, ultimately incenting behavior will hopefully get us closer to the outcome we want. But then the problem with that is that comp plan lives here and revenue lives here. And if you're going to give some sort of subsidy or tax incentive, those two have to somehow come together. And I don't understand how that happens. So I don't have an answerable question. I'm just posing it philosophically. Is there a way that we could create language, because you're absolutely right, how you phrase it determines a lot of your path. Is there a way that we can do something that will incent, you know, of clear cutting, because it's beneficial in many ways, but we got to make the timber companies whole too, because you know they're good people, and it's a business. So I just, yeah, okay.
This is all good stuff. All right, I want to move on to the forest lands, and this is an area where I think there are some big issues in this county. And I have identified a few of them from, like I said, reading the literature. And but the big overall issue is that it seems pretty clear that the forest we have today isn't going to be the forest we have tomorrow if our greenhouse gas emissions stay as they are. So we will have different species, different animals and plants. The trees will change, but they won't get up and move. And this is where the wildfire thing comes in, because as the Doug firs become more vulnerable to pests and drought and other threats, other stressors, they'll die off and the new trees will come in. But in the meantime, there may be an increased wildfire risk. That's something that I haven't seen addressed very well in the literature, but it's something I think the county needs to think about. So any thoughts about that? Let me see if I have any other things. Yeah, so we just don't know how this transition is going to roll out in the next few years. Okay, I'm going to take a question over here, and then people that have spoken before.
Thank you. My name is Donna Bing. I'm here representing the Chinook Indian Nation. We are proponents, absolute proponents for selective cutting. Our history, our ancestral history, does not condone, espouse, or participate in clear cutting. The Oregon Forestry Institutes have advertised that false claim, but we have no recorded history of clear cutting. We are a recyclable type situation. For instance, our main interest is to reestablish what has been taken away from our cultural needs, and that is the red cedar, the yellow cedar, the big leaf maple, the only maple that's native to this area, the Pacific yew, and the Oregon ash, which is primarily an important tree for our alone, just our canoe paddles. But we are beginning our working relationship with Greenwood Resources, the present landowner of all the forest area here in Southwest Washington and Clatsop, Columbia counties, whatever. Anyway, they have stepped forward and reached out to Chinook to see how we could bridge an understanding on what we want our forests to be. We introduced that fact about selective cutting. It is a compromise, provides income for those people that are in that business, allows us to have our forests. So there's a less carbon footprint that we are encouraging. So we're working now. We're not waiting, we're not talking to people. We're already into this new movement, especially our concerns about Clatsop Plains and the development is going to be insidious. It'll definitely affect water retention, drinking water, or water for survival in that area. And we're going to be more proactive in that situation. We don't see development as a positive, mass development as a positive, because of the limited amount of water that's available. We know through our ancestral cycles that droughts will be more prevalent. So we're going to try and address that by making sure that there's water for those people who are already here, which definitely includes our people.
Thank you, and I want to expand a little bit on that when you said the ancestral cedars. The Doug fir is not native to the extent that it is today. You did not, that's what I'm saying. So I really appreciate the idea of working to transition the forests into the new world, recognizing that what we have is not, quote, natural. So, yeah, it's a challenge. Exactly, monoculture and all that stuff, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, and I think I know many people in the room here. I'm Mark Morgans. I'm a forester with a major landowner, Greenwood. So I had a chance to take several of you out on a forest tour already as part of this comp plan review, and look forward to engaging and continuing. And I just want to say that we, look forward to, as a forest land owner, continuing that positive contribution to the solution for climate change. We're doing it as we speak. We've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of trees out there right now that are doing it. They're being actively managed to increase their growth and sustain their growth. And then at the same time, then when they reach a certain point, we're able to harvest those trees and be able to produce the jobs and then store that carbon in the as-built environment and start that process over again. The property we've been working on has been doing that about 120, 130 years already, and it is sustainable. We need to be a little careful, I think, if you start looking at changes to the comp plan that would provide any disincentives to that. So I would encourage, as far as the plan, to kind of encourage where we are with being able to keep those lands as productive as possible, allow us to manage them as we are, recognizing that on the fringe lands there might be an opportunity for us to participate in the communities as we've done in the recent past, working with Cannon Beach when they wanted to relocate a school outside the tsunami zone, and we sold them 55 acres to be able to do it. We've also worked in other areas for that too. So there is an opportunity. I'd look at that in the comp plan review. Back to your original question is, how can we keep forests in forestry, not provide disincentives to it, keep as many of the tools as we can for intensive forest management, including vegetation control, and then recognizing that contribution, and definitely not build anything in that would not allow a stable log supply that then could then incentivize an alternate species. We know that building is going to continue. If the logs aren't available for the mills, people are going to substitute for other things that actually could have a larger greenhouse gas footprint, which we don't want to do. So we want to be part of the solution, continuing that effort, getting the credit for what we're doing now. If there is some other creative ideas, opportunities that come out from it, we'll certainly consider that. I do appreciate that people are acknowledging it is privately owned property, but we do have the social responsibility that we've embraced, and we want to look at other alternatives if there's a way to actually increase that contribution. So I waited for forestry to be able to cover that. Would acknowledge is that we take it serious enough is that we do have 2 internal PhD scientists that actually looked at our property, did a thorough literature review of what the threats might be on it, and looked at everything from pest challenges might be. And I would agree with what's been acknowledged here is we see one of the bigger threats to our property as the fire hazard. Once we had identified that, we've already started some of the mitigation work, identifying infrastructure improvements to be able to respond to fire, opportunities to be able to use water for fire suppression. And that, again, back to the comp plan, could be a way where you're looking at buffers, separation between forest land and other ignition sources, perhaps right along where we sometimes see houses right next to our property line, and we have had fires start on our property from burn barrels and things like that. So that could be another way that when we implement say a burn ban or those types of activities in there too. Last, relating to the water, would be as I mentioned, I'm glad to hear that discussion. We do a really good job of protecting that water quality on our property and when it gets then off of our property. So we're kind of protective of it. We're doing a lot of times for both domestic consumption as well as for the fish. And that's another thing I think that the comprehensive plan could look at, is forecasting how much of that water is going to be available and then coming some sort of allocation. If there's going to be less of that available, but we're talking about population growth, consumption, does there need to be other reviews of other potential sources for water? We're next to a pretty large source. I've gone to other areas that actually uses the ocean for a significant amount of their domestic water. So considering those types of things are creative, and then having how much of the water are we going to leave in the creeks for the environment to pass through, if you will, compared to the temporary withdrawals that we do for domestic use before we put it back in. So, and then last, sorry, but relating to the fire, less water means less fire suppression ability. So just that concerns me also as a retired volunteer firefighter and as a wildland firefighter, is you put the wet stuff on the red stuff. That's what we learned. And if you have less wet stuff, there's going to be more red stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you. I have, as having forest lands, watched everything for 50 years. And when I first came, the term reprod, after you clear cut and replant, was what was happening. It was just the tangle that came back, and then there was hand release. The tangle partly was because it wasn't replanted, the whole history of in the Coast Range stuff. But what I would love and beg the big companies to do is put down ground cover, which helps with the heavy rains, protects the soils, and also let plants grow which don't burn as hard as grass would. One thing, a plug for big leaf maple, I think if it were studied, which I'd love the county to do, I think it's the best tree, hands down, for carbon capture for both the leaves going into the soil and the soil increase, which is as significant as the air holding of carbon, so, or trees. And also if vegetation would be let grow, you'll get more jobs for hand release, hand cutting of the brush, which was also industry standard 50 years ago in a lot of places. I know right on the coastal strip they may have been changed. But the other thing is it would keep the elk up there if there were things for them to eat, wouldn't have to poison with rodenticides, which get into the hawks for the mountain beaver. So let's let the hills be furry again.
Yeah, so you point out how interconnected things are. It's be our challenge. A lot of the issues that you bring up are super important, but not really addressable through the comp plan update. So we'll capture it all, but I just want you to be aware of that the comp plan can't do everything. So.
this is a sensitive one for us as a county. So there's been a lot of really great conversations around this one. We know we can't regulate what happens on, we don't have any jurisdiction over the Forest Practices Act. And then also this is the comp plan, as you said, not the updating the ordinances, which potentially will come next. So that's when we'll talk about actual rules and laws around what happens in our different zones. But so I'm having trouble just translating, okay, so we know all this. So, I feel like we've had a lot of really great conversations in all of our community groups and in the Planning Commission, but then actually taking this and saying, okay, well, this is then what we should say under this goal. So have you seen good examples of other counties or cities integrating this? So for example, putting as a goal in their, say the Southwest, which is where I am, the Southwest community, putting it as a goal in their comp plan, the beginning, forest lands are important in this area. We encourage blah, 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 or something. Do you have examples of that?
Yes.
That would be really helpful, is actually getting examples.
I do, and I hope to transition into that conversation in about 15 minutes. If you look at the worksheets, I did look at your comp plan and come up with some responses to some of these things as conversation starters. But you're absolutely right that we need to take this good information and turn it into goals and policies. So, and I hope to get to that conversation in about 15 minutes.
So this is related to the land use planning and also the forestry. I think that we can all agree that trees are pretty amazing in their ability to take carbon out of the air and lock it up in kind of permanent wood products. And so in order to ensure that that continues to happen, maybe part of the land use planning would be when looking at adjusting urban growth boundaries, that we don't incentivize deforestation, right? So that as we move that urban growth boundary around, we're not allowing for areas to be developed that are currently forest lands. So that's just an actionable item.
Absolutely, and I think if you look further in your worksheet, you'll see that's one of the suggested starting points that I came up with, was ensuring that new development doesn't just scrape all the trees off and then plant bushes instead. Yeah.
Thank you. So as I'm looking at this, so increased stormingness, intensive forestry, is there a potential for increased landslides? And does that come under Goal 7 hazards or forestry? I guess as things get stormier, both ag and all uses will probably have more of that. And so I just wanted to mention that here.
Yeah, this is our big challenge. It's all interconnected, and we have 19 land use plan goals that are all have separate bins.
Even though we cannot affect what happens on forest lands because of the Forestry Act, what we can do, though, is promote cooperation. Mark from Greenwood had suggested that they're open to suggestions. What we need to avoid is an us versus them syndrome. And because then you get into gridlock and nothing is going to happen, or people will be very upset regardless of what the outcome is. But we can do that, promote, especially say for instance in municipal watersheds would be a key area to promote cooperation between industry and the county.
Yeah, increased probability of wildfire. Perhaps the large woodland owners could put large storage water facilities so the firefighters could get in there and get water as needed.
I want to address the issue of increased pests and disease. My name's Dan Stark, and I'm an Oregon State Extension forester based here, and my background is in fire, insects, and disease. And this is stuff that is really important and something that I really love. And we can pretty much extend those effects across this whole thing here. Pests will be responding in all of these arenas and in ways that we don't know. As more people move into our area, they bring pests with them. People are the most common way that pests are introduced in new areas, including through our firewood and on our furniture and that kind of stuff. So we really have to take this issue of a pest kind of issue. It's a big concern that we have to really think critically about. And one way that this could also be impacted is this tree species shifting and this range of trees shifting. And there's something called assisted migration, and it's a controversial topic within the science community and outside of the science community. And I just want to talk a little bit, just quickly, to think about in our planning that we can address later. There's recent research out of the Pacific Northwest Station where they've summarized some forest studies on Douglas fir, actually. And Douglas fir is a candidate for being moved, a successfully adaptable species. And they think that there might be some genetic triggers that they have the ability to respond to drought in ways that we can't realize yet. So I've heard some sentiment about, Douglas fir not being native in this area, but it might be in the future. So we have to keep those ideas open, as controversial that they are, that might be a more suitable species that actually grows and adapts well here.
Eugene is planting redwoods.
One of the things that I have learned as being one of the volunteers on the Citizen Advisory Council is that 85% of Clatsop County is forests. So what happens in our forests affects everything else to a huge degree. I am particularly interested in what you have listed under stream flow. And stream flow combined with the increased air temperature, combined with summer drought, you have unknown effects on stream flow, but it pretty much means reduced stream flow. And a decreased stream flow feeds directly into an increased stream temperatures. And the streams that originate in all of our forests flow either into, obviously, the Columbia River or the Pacific Ocean. So that everything is interconnected keeps overlapping. And the one that I'm particularly interested in is this increased stream temperature directly affects an increased salmon mortality, increased fish mortality, which then impacts another industry, the whole fishing industry, and affects our food supply. So increased stream temperature in our forests affects so many other things, and it is one that I think we need to be tracking.
I'd like to also talk about increased temperatures in the streams. The biggest contributor to that, of course, is clear cutting. The standing mature forests shade the ground. They prevent wind and air circulation from getting in contact with the ground, like any windrow crop. It'll protect it from evaporation. It also, conversely, protects from landslides and flooding by uptaking water from the hydrologic horizon in the soil, preventing hydraulic flow and maintaining granular flow in the soil column at a critical layer that keeps the land. The results of clear cutting are pretty clear. Lower flow of streams, a reduced flow of water, higher temperatures, and that has a tremendous impact on fishing and upon the economy. We simply have to ban clear cutting, and we should start with our watershed areas to prevent the spraying of herbicides, which also is a major contributor to our problems.
Okay, so in all these thoughts here, how would you translate those issues into comp plan goals and policies? That's what we have to start thinking about, and we're going to start thinking about it in about 5 minutes. Otherwise, we'll never get out of here.
So with regard to how forestry affects our land use plans, studies have indicated that the relative risk to the biological community is a function of land use. The lowest risk is with the forestry classification as you compare it to agricultural or urban. And as many people have said here today, temperature stressors to the salmonid populations is going to be a major factor. It's the number one factor now, and it's only going to get worse with climate change. And so recognizing that, tying the preservation of forest lands to maintaining the ecological integrity and ultimately the ability to sustain salmonid runs, I think is an important factor to take into consideration.
I'm going to take 2 more questions, and I want to move on to some of the other goals very quickly, because like I said, I want to get to the, there was one over here.
It's interesting when we talk about forest lands, because Oregon Humanities came to Cannon Beach, and one of the results of the discussion was people were conflating forest lands with parklands. And so when we look, I look at costs and benefits, and I look at that because our tax base depends on having businesses that contribute taxes so we can provide essential community services. The foundations in Oregon are starting to look at the increasing gap between the cost of essential public services and our revenue streams that pay for those. So for me, the background isn't just the quality of life on Earth, it's how do we sustain communities that really function, because we need schools and public safety and roads and public health and all of that. So it's the balancing act and the calculation. I love the being vulnerable and compassionate with one another, and I want to compliment you on moderating this, because you're doing that.
All right. This is the last one on this issue, and then I'm going to move on to the other goal.
Just one thing on taxes, if all timberland paid into county taxes, that would be great. I'd love to see who was shortfalling on paying off on forest fire stuff if it's published somewhere. And the big thing for planning, which means changing the Forest Practices Act. The Forest Practices Act, which keeps being referenced as the gold standard, is a legislative thing, and it can be changed. And the big change that needs to happen that will help in a lot of stuff that's been just talked about on water flows a bunch of ways, is that the heads of the creeks, not the year-round portion, but the whole system where the water is collecting in the wintertime to come down, where it is a creek in the wintertime, should be considered be all managed the same as the year-round creeks. It would make a huge difference, I think.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to quickly go with the other goals. You've brought up a lot of the issues that relate to the other goals. So I hope we talked about air and water quality. This format's not great for it. Okay, the other one is recreation and natural hazards. We've talked some about natural hazards, about the flooding, the landslides, wildfire, and so on. So I don't want to belabor that unless you have something new you want to add. And then recreation is a land use planning goal category that I don't know if we have a whole lot to say there, but 2 minutes on this subject.
Pat Corcoran reminds us, who's in the room, that reminds us that, so South County, which relies a lot on tourism, which relies on recreation and open space, will all be rip-wrapped under sea level rise, and the beaches will be going away, and we will lose beach access. And so those go under open space, natural resources, and under recreation. There'll be a loss of walkable beaches and a loss of access. And as a result, there will be a loss of tourism, both because of loss of access, but also in the summertime due to smoke pollution like we had 2 summers ago. It hit here as well as other places in the state. And then I just, under natural hazards, just want to again say, in terms of diversity, recognizing that poorer people tend to be in the riskiest places. And already we're putting most of our low-income housing and poorer people in Warrenton, which is one of the more risky places in terms of tsunamis, sea level rise, and earthquakes and all that other stuff. So we need to acknowledge that, I think, overtly in our comp plan.
Very good.
With regard to recreation, which is one of our goals, it's important that we have access to the forest land, and if you drive around the county, you'll notice that most of the access to the forest land is blocked by gates. It seems to me that we need to put regulations in that limit the gates and use of gates and access to our forest lands. By the way, that kind of recreation is also a source of income for the county.
Hikers, birders.
The Greenwood land is open year-round for recreation for free. You guys people register. The gates were there because of abuse of that privilege in the past, and so they were put into that mechanism. We do know that they've been there for a while. But you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you out on our property. As long as I haven't closed it, is during high fire danger, and so you've seen some connection. If we go back to have more higher fire danger in the property or in the area because of climate change, there's a probability to get less access to forest land because of that concern.
So maybe some more education about that is in order. I have a question over here.
I just think as far as things we can do in our comprehensive plan, and this may come up in later points as well, part of what Nadia was talking about with riprap on the coastal areas is encouraging the state to look at ways to lift some of the limits on what properties are grandfathered in to being able to fortify their coastline, and so that we don't have a situation where essentially we have rising sea levels and we have a patchwork of riprap or barriers along the coast, because right now my understanding from the coast workshop that we had last year was that properties that didn't have it or weren't established before the mid-70s aren't able to then fortify their property if the fortification doesn't exist. So as we look down our coast, new development won't be able to put in a dike or riprap or anything to protect themselves, and that of course makes the neighboring properties vulnerable even if they have their own protection. So us, the county, putting in goals or policies that encourage the state to change that might be helpful.
Big topic, and that ties into also the topic of managed retreat and doing transferable development rights so that you take those properties that people own and have rights to and give them rights to develop somewhere else. So yeah, that's a big, complicated issue.
Just to briefly review the pattern of sea level rise on our coast from the Cape Flattery down to Coos Bay is we're rising up out of the Pacific Basin about 3 millimeters a year because of plate tectonics. And we're going to subside after a tsunami 6 to 8 feet all in a few moments. And you won't have an opportunity to put riprap on your beach then.
And I do want to support that viewpoint. If you look at the new the study of the State of Washington, you'll find sea level rise is not as big a scary of a thing here as it is in many other places.
Well, I disagree a little bit on that. Our ancestors experienced that tsunami before this was settled.
That's before not taking into account tsunami.
Right, well, my question is, has any entities explored the need to raise the levees that are currently in place in the Warrenton, Port of Astoria area? I believe those are federally governed, but I'm not sure on that. We need to explore that mitigation or that possibility of raising the levees. That's in the lower Columbia River area.
Yep, those are federal levies, and yeah, there are issues there we need to consider.
And I guess just, so with hazards and the comp plan, I guess I would just counter my friend and colleague over there, but I think the position of the comp plan should really support Goal 18 and the laws that flow from the Oregon change built 50 years ago that are just sort of now being challenged, and maybe have a vigorous look at the pros and cons of that, and caveat emptor and disclosure and things like that. And what is the public responsibility for private decisions and the protection of those private decisions after a date with which they should have known? Or maybe we can talk to the legislature about increasing disclosure for real estate transactions on the coastal strip. That might be something outside of this bailiwick. But I would just put that in that there's different views, and that's something the comp plan needs to flesh out and think about that in the public good.
Right. Just because I want to move on.
So, well, I'm glad Greenwood Industry, which interfaces the most with all our coastal residents, is working with us because it's hugely important. And one of the things I wish, like the city of Astoria, didn't just kick out the homeless. I'm not sure all the homeless, anyway, that homeless population is growing steadily because of investment finances, everything else under the sun. And it has to be acknowledged. Otherwise, they go into the woods, and the fire danger of them living in the woods really increases things. So if we want to recreate in the forest, we have to own up to dealing with how to homeless people be in a safe environment for everybody, them included, and the forests. Thank you.
Okay, again, so many interconnections. It's really amazing. All right, so I will give the microphone to you while I transition to our next worksheet. Recognizing we haven't gone through all the goals yet, but I really want to get to this conversation. So.
Well, my suggestion is on the comp plan, it can be divided into 3 aspects for the natural hazard. One is identifying where they are. 2 is to develop policies to reduce the potential for incompatible development. And 3 is to promote some kind of a mitigation strategy, a glide path for people who are in these danger zones, so that encourage them to somehow reduce the impact of the natural hazards to them. And there's a variety of ways, and that's left to the county commissioners to deal with.
Yeah. So those are great suggestions, and I think you'll see them reflected in my conversational seeds here. So, for example, on the last one that encourage mitigation, one of the impediments that I see is that the process of accessing FEMA grants to do buyouts, for example, is so complicated and so onerous that most governments don't want to deal with it. So maybe there's an opportunity for the state to do more training, more facilitation of that kind of thing, and also for the governments, local governments, rather than saying, oh, it's too much work, to train them, access that training. So that would be a comp plan thing. You could say that they will commit to getting that training and learning about those programs. Anyway, okay, so I want to transition to a new topic of conversation. We've touched on a lot of the consequences, and you can go through the worksheet and think about other consequences and the other goals, but we've touched on a lot of them. So I don't think we're missing too much by skipping into this next conversation, which is really where I wanted to go in the first place. We have talked about some of these potential solutions. So in each of the goals we have, or each of the elements of the comp plan, there are goals and policies. And I put out these as basic conversation pieces to start you thinking. And one of my intentions in doing this workshop and workshops in other places is to help you be more specific in articulating those goals and policies as they relate to climate change. Because a lot of the comp plan amendments that I've seen here in the state and elsewhere say basic things like, we will pay attention to climate change. Well, that doesn't really get you very far, right? It doesn't give you solid enough ground to walk on. So one of my intentions in coming here today is to help you think about how to make specific climate, what we're calling climate savvy goals and policies. So when we get into the citizen involvement realm, we can say things like advance the understanding by residents of the implications of climate change so they may make informed decisions and participate fully in the planning process. We kind of talked about that already. And also, another goal might be that the county will work to identify who those vulnerable populations are and not treat everyone in the county as equally vulnerable. So thoughts along these lines?
I think when you're identifying the vulnerable population, you also need to invite them to the table.
Absolutely.
What they need to do to fix it, but participate in the thinking, going to make sure they have answers that we don't ever know about because we don't invite them to participate.
Very good. That's exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to hear.
Could you repeat that?
She said that the county should not only identify vulnerable populations, but invite them into the conversation and learn from them what they need and what solutions they may have. Yep. Yes.
There's several points that I get in these meetings. To bring the conversation to the employee at the job.
Go to
So they
them
don't
rather
go to
than
them,
coming
so
to
they
you.
don't have to miss work and bring whoever's sympathetic to that. And there are. Go that direction
Yeah.
instead of trying to bring them here. Go there.
Yeah, very good. Any other thoughts?
I do think we know three, the vulnerable populations, the ones who are just hanging on tooth and nail money-wise and have housing, the homeless population, which is growing, and the undocumented citizen thing, which is much harder to deal with right in this year than the Forest Practices Act, but I would love that they could come out of the woodwork, get documentation, make the whole thing of being able to work up. There's so many jobs out there in the forests that they could be doing. It would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, some other classes of vulnerable populations are the elderly who may not be able to respond quickly to, say, an evacuation order or be able to respond to a heat wave. Children who are sensitive to air quality problems and don't have the ability to respond by themselves. And so there are many classes of vulnerable populations that we can pay attention to. Yeah.
I think around here, particularly the elderly and heat waves can be very deadly because, from what I've heard, you would think areas like Phoenix would have, the most deaths related to heat waves, but that's not actually true because they have almost universal air conditioning, whereas here, almost nobody has air conditioning. So if we have a week-long heat wave, it can be incredibly deadly.
Yeah, so we haven't talked about heat wave, and I'm glad you brought that up. So what the research says about Clatsop County is that, well, all over the state, we are more susceptible to heat waves than we have been in the past. Clatsop County would go from, in the worst case scenario, 0 to a 3-day heat wave. So a 3-day heat wave doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you have never had to deal with it, and all of a sudden you have to deal with it without planning for it, you're in trouble because heat waves kill people, lots of people. So heat, we got to think about heat. Yep.
I just wanted to, on this first point here, of
Yep.
advancing the understanding of residents, I want to make sure that we capture the commissioner's good input here, maybe to identify ways where we can involve citizens in certain, activities. And I think that your area of watershed is a really great group. There's a lot of history around watershed groups coming together with people in the community and people with industry and working to solve problems. So looking for those ways where we can actively involve our citizens and identify some key areas might help us going forward.
So identifying already functioning groups like watershed councils or clubs and partnerships.
Incorporating more of the public voice in those kind of thing, and participatory science in particular.
Right.
And perhaps
we kind of talked about tourism, but kind of not talked about tourism. And the reality of it is that if we can help educate the tourists about fire danger and, proper, forest practices and having fun and being safe, it also helps us in a broader sense because more people will then enjoy it safely, but also because we'll be able to have people here, get their money, which is lovely because it's good for our economy. But tourists, and they can help evangelicals?
Yes.
Proselytize, that's share their knowledge and appreciate what we have here and maintaining it instead of destroying it.
Right, and a follow-on to that is in New Zealand, they find they're very active in educating their tourists, and they find that the tourists want to go there because they feel like they're being proactive, and visiting there is therefore not a bad thing.
Right? They're part of it. We're in this all together.
Right, exactly. So you got a comment?
I don't expect everybody to think alike, but I know there are some people here who actually went to high school in Clatsop County, but I'm just curious how many, because, I don't expect us all to reach consensus. But these gatherings tend to be people who aren't from here. There's no, like when we do a housing study, now there's no way in hell the people who are doing the housing study want to have homeless people involved in that process. I know there is somebody here in the room who went to high school here, but generally, this is not, it's parallel play. It's like watching the U.S. Senate. It's just, you are expecting any coming together. Just a mention on Mark and his timber company, and Jim's comment about avoiding getting in the us, them attitude. That timber company is not owned by misers. It's a pension plan.
Right.
It's just one of these funny things where he doesn't mention it, but it's hardly us and them, even with the usual attitude with which we start in thinking about those timber companies that own 85% of the county.
Right, well, through conversation, it's possible, maybe, I hope, to find little bits of common ground and then build from there. That's why conversation is so important. In my
I just wanted to mention, the solar eclipse, was it last year? I think it was last year, or was it the year before? 2 years ago? Good God. But that was a phenomenal success in the fact of the fear that was connected with that, the traffic jams and forest fires, and they just thought it was going to be a disaster for the state. And the state and the local communities and Travel Oregon and other people got the word out and really worked on educating people, and they had a very successful event where people were able to enjoy it, but also there wasn't bad ramifications for forest and private land. And so, I mean, that's an example of something that did work well.
Just briefly about point 4, in last year's 2020 legislative bill, I did a lot of research on my own and discovered that clear cutting is a large source of, even if you plant right afterwards, it's a very large source of carbon. The majority of carbon, of course, is not stored in the trees, it's stored in the soils. And a mature forest stores a great deal of carbon in the soils, and that after clear cut and replanting has taken place, it takes to 25 to 35 years before the net carbon outflow from the decaying matter in the soils is replenished by new contributions. And that, and of course the simple reality that intense forest fires occur in second plantings and in second growth forests because of the fuel load, and that this fuel load is not present in a mature forest. I just wanted to say that in point 4, the mention of carbon sequestration raises a very real possibility. And as skeptical as I am, and many people are, about a cap and trade and carbon credit trading regimes or schemes, if there is any money to be had from carbon credits, we should be looking for ways to get that as a way to transition and help our timber companies transition to a regenerative forest practice of managing the forests to maximize carbon sequestration and minimize the contribution of clear cutting to, I mean, clear cutting is one of the largest sources of carbon in the state of Oregon. It's really, you think, oh, coal-fired power plants and other things like factories and that contribute, but it's our forest practices that contribute the most carbon. And I was taught by my uncle, look, when you're in a hole and you want to get out, stop digging first.
Exactly. The reason I added carbon sequestration up there in point number 4 is because in the existing comp plan, there's a list of benefits of forests, and sequestration's not on there. So I thought it would be a simple thing to add, and therefore it would allow policies to be developed that support that goal.
Okay, so first and foremost, just so that you know, I keep hearing the little subtle hints of like, hey, state legislator, this is what we want you to do. So I am writing that down, so don't worry. But I want to try to, at least for my comments, try to keep it relevant to the discussion at hand, which is what can the county do in updating their strategic plan to try to make sure that we address some of these issues. So I wondered about land use planning. My neighbor here mentioned something about like heat waves and all of that. And I don't know if this goes into the land use planning discussion, but in terms of updating like building codes and modifying zoning regulations, making sure that new development and creating opportunities for even existing development to be able to add, for example, air conditioning, so that we can help reduce the likelihood of something happening, you know, to especially a very expansive elderly population that lives here. Because I really feel like heat waves have a potential to really hurt them. On top of that, as I was going through through some of these other things on here, the county incentivizing or at least noting how important it is to look at energy conservation, updating homes and insulation, and then transportation, building out a more substantial public transportation infrastructure so that hopefully more people can take advantage of that. Because one of the struggles we have right now with our public transportation infrastructure is if your bus only comes every hour, that's not really helpful for people who have to get somewhere. And coming from a social services background, we would even have issues with people who were struggling, for example, to get like to their court dates. Based off of public transportation. And so that would go a long way towards helping not only reduce greenhouse gases, but also towards making it just easier for people to get around.
Right. And if it's hard to get around on public transportation, you have 4 kids, you're going to have to do your grocery shopping less often, and how do you carry all, I mean, it's, again, all interconnected. Did you have something to say?
Quickly, just to add to her. So we replaced our old resistance heaters with a heat pump, which is both an air conditioner and a heater. We obviously use it for heating mostly, but there is 1 or 2 days a year where it's great that it has that feature. So, you know, Energy Trust offers great incentives for that. I don't know how the comprehensive plan can tie into that, but it is something that I think is important, especially for the, you know, the elderly population here is much more vulnerable to heat wave death.
I just want to note that 10 to 20% of our local communities are Spanish speaking, and just adding them to a vulnerable group just because communicating with our Spanish speaking population is more challenging. And I actually got Clatsop alerts last night because our tsunami siren shorted, and it just emailed me in English, actually some bad information, the wrong thing. But if I was a Spanish speaking person, first of all, getting email, we rely on having computers, so not everybody necessarily has a computer, and then it was in English. So already, I just saw that right away, like, oh, wait, but I wanted to maybe just suggest an edit. So I know these are just some suggestions. So Clatsop County shall identify populations who are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and communicate with them with options. And I'll say, I think that's not enough. I think that we actually have to work with them, as noted in the room, on potential solutions, which might include, the county and the state supporting them reducing their exposure. Because I think that just sharing information, hey, you could move out of Warrenton, it doesn't really help if you're in a really vulnerable position. And so, so I think those kinds of changes this was great. It's great additions.
So remember, we're talking about solutions now.
So just recognizing that ag lands, we ought to put something underneath there, and I think we do have a consensus here that the trees can be part of the solution, and so this would be something, again, that the committees, perhaps the comp plan could consider would be is there some, what are the additional opportunities for afforestation? Where there's some areas that actually supported trees historically and have been converted to a different use now, and now is that use that they've been converted for in the past still the best use for that property? And there's the potential, I believe, as I drove over here from Seaside to Astoria, that perhaps there's some agricultural lands that if the landowner wanted to voluntarily convert those back into forests, there'd be a way to kind of write in an incentive there. Perhaps there would actually be some financial contributions. The zoning might change back to forestry, so there could be actually some savings in taxes for that. But do we have some lands now, and we know that there's stored carbon on those agricultural lands too, particularly underground, but is there a way to take those lands and put them back into a more rapid carbon sequestration state?
I brought up in other meetings too about cluster development, and I just think it has to be implemented to both have areas you can have more clusters of people living with water and sewage issues dealt with, and that the lands that are, like if it's 5-acre residential, you take 1 acre off, that other 4 acres, or somehow, I think you need to use the wording to be able to and dedicate land then to agriculture or forestry while doing this, and it is part county, and then thinking about the F80 lands, because as soon as you get off the coastal plain, which is flooding and tsunami prone, you get into forest land. So the F80 zoning issue.
So one of the, first of all, I have to say, what's on this list comes from the limits of my imagination. So part of the reason I wanted to talk about this was to bring in all your imaginations. So the other thing I want to say is that, while getting this screen back up, is that one of the challenges that you're going to face doing a comp plan update is how to deal with future conditions, and how to bring into your planning decision-making and your goals and policies addressing a future that you don't know about. And so I think that's something that you all need to think about really carefully in light of the state's requirement that development permits be issued using clear and objective standards. That's a big challenge. So put your thinking caps on for that one.
So I think one of the challenges for our comp plan evolving forward is, so I don't know if you've tried to read our comp plan, but you would have had to start a couple years ago.
Yeah.
It's like 2,200 pages, 2,300.
I looked at the summary.
And I think part of that was an attempt by the people who were making that comp plan to include all of this information that would provide a foundation for understanding and what we would be working on going forward to provide this common ground. And I think even things like what Ted brought up about how we characterize carbon sequestration rates and what the best point for us to forest that, how soon should we cut, how much should we cut? All of these things are variable we treat our forested land, which is a big part of our county. And frankly, we don't have common ground on that, I don't think. You know, I've heard that response that Ed gave largely agrees with what I think or what I've read. But when we've had these public meetings, especially about Gulf War, we've heard very different things from different audiences. And so I think one of the things that we've got to think about is how to maintain a repository of information that gives us a foundation going forward, and how we update that as we go forward. You know, we can't, things are going to change in 20 years before we get the chance to try and do this process again. So this needs to be iterative while we're going along, and we need to have something we can agree on, and even a citizen involvement process that allows people to keep coming back in and say, hey, this has changed. New science says this is different. We should adapt as we go along. And I think this is a really open challenge that I don't know that we've figured out yet.
Yeah, you're right. And someone mentioned citizen science, so also have a way for people to tell you things are different out here than they were a while ago, whether that's 5 years or 10 years or whatever.
I just wanted to, and perhaps this isn't the broader, more detailed plan, but in terms of natural hazard and this kind of preparation for, I think that it would be good for the county to partner with institutions like Oregon State, for example, and other state agencies and county to really help with planning and evacuation routes and that kind of stuff, and preparedness for when a disaster happens. We need to have some broad planning on that, and we need to have drills, and we need to practice these things, because one-lane roads exist everywhere, and we think we're going to be able to flee somewhere, and the reality is we probably aren't. So we're going to have to practice where we go, and then I see Pat's raising his hand here. So really, how can we as a community, come together and practice these things?
Yep. Practice is good.
When I went to the AOC annual conference this year, Commissioner Les Perkins from Hood River had a wonderful workshop on energy independence. And like we found out in the 2007 storm, we were isolated, and that's what motivated so many people to become ham radio operators and whatnot. So if we think further than that, then how do we keep the power on in the hospitals? How do we keep the gas, what we do have here? How do we have electricity to keep that flowing? So is there a way for us to look at how to, I don't know what the word is, micronize, or to make a little pods of energy resilience all over? We all know that we are dealing with an aging infrastructure for energy, and what's coming is different than what was. And so how do we as a county capitalize on that? One of the suggestions that I really liked that Commissioner Perkins said was, we know that the electric highway is coming. So how do we get out ahead of that? Do we have land, does the county have land that we can put a charging station on it? And then when people pay to charge that money goes to us to maintain those roads, or whatever that is. And so we need to think about ways that we can be out ahead of this and capitalize on it in order to make it good for the people, but also pay us to provide that service, instead of having private companies come in and take that out from us before we even get there. So.
Great, and while I'm going to go over to Pat, but while I'm doing that, I want to mention that infrastructure vulnerability that you may not be thinking enough about is telecommunications. Because your cell systems drive so much now, and they're not regulated in the way that you'd hope them to be for reliability.
All right, thanks. And it's not tsunami related, but I would just say one practical thing the comp plan process could do would be to adopt the hazard maps that are produced by the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. I mean, we've accepted them, which means we acknowledge they exist, but to adopt them means we use them in decision-making with land use planning. And we haven't adopted the best maps in the world that relate to hazards that can inform our land use planning. So that'd be a very specific thing I would advocate.
Yep, very good. I'm going to move on to some other people. Is there anyone that hasn't spoken? I'd really like to hear from people who are in the background here.
So I'm not sure if later in this discussion, transportation is more prominent. I have to say, I was particularly pleased to hear two of our elected officials in here, Commissioner Sullivan and Representative Mitchell, zone right in on an issue that I feel like we haven't been discussing much, which is there's been a lot of discussion about carbon sequestration, which is an incredibly complicated topic that there's active scientific debate on and a lot of argument. And it's kind of difficult to build policy on that, particularly on anything that we're reading individually online. If that's something the county is really interested in, I would highly suggest employing an expert that might be able to provide some real good, solid input based on current science. On the other hand, the decrease of carbon emissions is something that we all know how to accomplish, and we can start it right now, and that's something I haven't heard come up in this discussion today at all. As part of this comprehensive planning process, I'd really like to hear how we can build into the comp plan fossil fuel reduction goals, particularly around our transportation system, around the transportation people are using to come to recreate here from other parts of the state. There's very little public transit infrastructure. The bicycle community loves coming out here, but they don't have any way of getting out here on their bikes or with their bikes except a private vehicle. There's no publicly available charging infrastructure for electric vehicles here. I'd personally love to make use of one, but I don't have that option with my job at the moment. So I think that that's a real opportunity in this comprehensive plan. We can build in thoughtfulness about how we transition away from a fossil fuel-based energy system, into a new one. It's a 50-year plan. So.
There's a public EV charger at the bus station, and then there are 8 stalls in Seaside for Tesla.
Yeah, thank you for the correction. I travel in rural areas of the county quite a bit, and that's really good. Thank you for helping.
Yeah, I think electric charging infrastructure is really critical for carbon.
My name is John Enzer. I've been here 15 years. I haven't spoken today because I hate to speak at meetings where we're talking about failure. And what I've seen since I've lived in this county is failure to really address the problem of solving some of the problems with carbon emissions so we don't have to worry about climate change as much as we are worried about. But this county has continually failed to look at those kind of problems. The state has continually failed to look at reducing carbon emissions because, to be quite frank with you, they don't have the expertise to deal with these types of issues. Now, I'm going to go away, and I'm sure a lot of people would be very happy that I'm going to go away because I like to talk about how to solve problems rather than how to fix problems after they're already here. But nobody here in the last 15 years that I've been here ever wants to talk about how to fix problems. They all how to not create problems. They just want to let them happen and then work and get a very nice crowd of very nice informed people. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm not sure input was tremendously important. You and I have seen each other over the years. I can't even get a meeting with our new representative for 10 minutes I get nothing. I get nowhere with these people. I'm a very educated person. I'm a reasonable person, but I'm all done with it. And I'm sorry that it has been such a mess for me, and I'm sorry that I've impeded your process over all of these years. But I just wanted to sit back here and listen to the fact that this is a meeting of failure. This is failure. Now, we should try to get better, but we have failed over 15 years. And
Mr. Gunter, may I ask you a question?
of course,
So, going back to our topic at hand, how would you take what you see as failures and give us one positive policy to put into our comprehensive that would address it? Just one.
one,
Yeah, just one.
what I would like to see is I would like somebody to attack the carbon emissions from those 4 power plants that are out there on the Columbia River, because there's a no-cost solution that would put us right smack in the right range for Oregon. We can't solve the problems of the world, but we can take a whack at Oregon, and we can take a whack at Clatsop County. But nobody wants to talk about these kind of things.
Okay. And I think our mic is
Sorry.
So anyway, so your policy is that we
trying to worry about fixing all of these problems. Why don't we eliminate the problem, then we won't have to worry so much about fixing it, okay? And over 15 years, I've seen consistently that the people in this particular area and the people in Oregon have not been willing and not been able to address those kind of things. And then I think it's a failure. And I hate to have meetings with nice people who are really concerned, who have good ideas, and we get a lot of nice people here, but we've already failed. I mean, we could have avoided all of this if we'd have just gotten something going 15 years ago when it was brought up.
Well, we can't go back, so.
Yes, I know we can't, but we can learn from that experience and work a little bit more on trying to go back to what this gentleman was just talking about, which is the mitigation of the problem, rather than how to fix it.
And Mr. Jones, I just wanted to thank you for coming to all these meetings over the years.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate your input. Thank you very much.
I appreciate you taking an interest in this county. As I do have an appreciation for you, Leanne, because I appreciate what you do. Thank you very much for all the support you've given me over the years.
Great.
Bye, John.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gunzer, because that's true. And so I didn't go to high school here, but I went to high school in downtown Portland, and I'm now 45 years old. But 27 years later, that town is different. Well, it's having some growth problems right now. But I will say, from a transportation perspective, they did a couple things right, which was they put in the infrastructure to support alternative transportation. But you can't just put in the infrastructure. You actually have to get people to use it and get people to know that it's there in the first place, right? And so what Portland did, and that was a collaboration between a lot of kooky artists that existed there because they could afford it back in the day, making bicycling cool. And walking and using buses. And my sister actually started this bans on the streetcar to get people actually on the streetcar because it was so slow you couldn't even catch it. But now if you go to Portland, all people are using alternative transportation, and they're using it because they know it's the right thing to do, not because it's always the most practical. And that's one thing we're definitely missing in our county. So I just note that when I was in high school, I rode my bike to school because it was actually faster than the bus. But no one else was doing it. And now 10 to 20% of the people are actually commuting every day on alternative transport. Well, actually just on bicycles. Then there's a lot more using alternative transportation. So really it's about culture change. You know, it's about really getting us to all realize, I mean, how many here in this room took alternative transportation to get here, or carpooled at least? I tried to carpool, but then ended up having to drive a truck because there's flooding on the Highway 101 in Seaside. But anyway, I think that cultural part and that public-private partnership is really key to making these kinds of transportation changes to reduce our emissions in terms of our personal vehicles.
Right, so I just want to mention briefly before I pass the mic, 45% of our carbon emissions come from transportation in this state.
So yeah, I wanted to touch on that as well. From what Kathleen was talking about, my family has 2 electric vehicles, and so we do all of our transportation via electric vehicle. And there is an emerging technology that is being currently worked on where electric vehicles can be a source of resilience and backup battery systems. And they're great because they're mobile. So let's say we had a situation where we were cut off from the grid and our hospital didn't have electricity. Me and my partner could both drive our electric vehicles to the hospital along with other electric vehicle owners. And, you know, if we get this vehicle to grid, you know, system operational, which I think it should be within the next couple of years, then we could be that backup power source for our community. And, you know, so I think getting that kind of technology operational, it's already like physically possible. It's just not, there's not the software interface to make it happen. So I think that is a huge solution, and getting more people to buy electric vehicles so that we have that resiliency within our community.
So what would be a comp plan, goal, or policy that would facilitate that? Because as you know, there's lines going blank there.
More charging stations, price
markets, places like that, encourage them to include in their plan a series of charging stations so that people that come to use the facility can charge their car.
In Norway, there's a tremendous incentive to use electric cars. That's it. You pull up to the stoplight and find 11 Teslas. They have so many incentives for electric cars, it's ridiculous. Oh my gosh. That's the key to electric cars down here. Tax incentives, free parking. There's a whole plethora of what they do.
Right. Right. So again, let's think about language that we could put in the comp plan, goals and policies that would facilitate that. I'm going to go here and then here.
I really appreciate your focus on the comp plan and what we can do and how we can word it. For me and a number of other people in this room who've been coming to workshops and sessions for an extended period of time, this is focusing on the positive. I'm sorry, Mr. Dunzer's not in the room. This is the most powerful, most effective workshop that I have attended yet. And I really appreciate you helping us to figure out how to get the things that we want into the comp plan. And I really appreciate you giving us wording. The one that you wrote down for forest lands is to add carbon sequestration to a list of reasons why forests shall be conserved. And I can see a number of things that we could add into reasons why forests shall be conserved. I like that wording. Thank you for giving us that wording. And I, who was focused on streams, I mean, I can see my team now writing one that cool, healthy streams as habitat for salmonid shall be added to the reasons why forests shall be conserved. So thank you for helping us to focus on how to get this into the comp plan instead of just talking and talking and talking and talking.
I'm going to go over here and then to you.
So I would suggest that number 13, energy conservation, be modified to be energy conservation and production. I belong as an individual, and now Clatsop County also belongs to CREA, the Community Resources for Energy Alternatives. They are mostly an Eastern Oregon organization, so they think about solar and wind. I encourage them to think about wave. As Patrick said, we have the ocean here. We have to think about the impact on fishing. But if we could have energy alternatives offshore, then we would have more local resources, and that's having the source of power near us is better.
On number 12, transportation, I suggest that we reach out to the Sunset Empire Transportation District. I know as an advisory group, we haven't. I don't know if the staff has. But, since they're in the business of providing bus service, not only locally within the county, but also to, in conjunction with Amtrak, Northwest Point to Portland. And it might be advantageous to have some long-range discussions, long-range planning with them to see if we can align what we're doing is what they have intended to do.
Just to support that?
Just to support that. What was the organization? The Sunset Empire Transit District, just down the street. Kathy Klezik's specific job is to work on developing those systems. So there is a staff person whose job is to do that. She's very interested in speaking with all of us or any of us.
Regarding energy production, we could encourage more solar energy production on houses. And we could do so by giving some breaks on things such as window area or other things in the building code so that people be encouraged to do that.
I think putting the wording in, and I think it could just go right into the plan, forest uses, carbon capture, sequestration. In the future, I think the carbon market and it's going to be really important. And grants. I think that having land with that in there would help with getting grants, carbon markets in the future. It's not set up now, but I think it's important to be there, and I lost another idea. Thanks.
Okay. Some good ideas coming out.
So another idea I had was with regard to solar, one of the problems we have here in Oregon is that we don't currently allow for virtual net metering. So if we want to do a community solar project as a community, we can't get credit on our power bill. So I could, in other states such as Colorado, they do allow for virtual net metering. So if you don't have an ideal roof for solar, say you have a lot of trees or you're a renter, you could be part of a community solar project in Colorado where you own 15 solar panels and someone else owns 15 and someone else owns 15, and then each of you gets credit on your power bill against, the solar panels that you own that's part of this community solar project. But because we don't have, our power companies are not required to allow for virtual net metering, we can't do that here. So that is something I think we should add to our solutions, is to mandate that power companies start a virtual net metering system.
The Public Utility Commission is who we need to respond to. We need our representatives and people from our state to ask for net metering, because they are the one who make the state set policies on energy.
Great. All right. Oh, I see another hand over here.
I just want to mention the sewage treatment plants. I think we need to get out ahead of this. It's a growing problem, and one of the things, because we're rural, so much of our county is rural, the septic tanks need to be pumped. There's a limited, where we take care of that after that. So I know I'm not talking very eloquently about this, but how can the county get ahead of this? Earlier they mentioned combustible, we don't want combustible, we want compostable, composting toilets. That would really be a step backwards. Jeez. So anyways, but the reality of more population here, how do we take care of that end of it? That's just something that I think we need to concentrate on when we have an opportunity. And I'll let other people that know more about it than me talk about it.
Can I riff on that for just a second? Maybe so there's an expert in the room. I've had a concern lately about septic systems in the areas where we're going to see sea level rise and saltwater intrusion and storm surge. And I think we're already seeing the effect of that with beach closures in all the coastal counties. So I think that's something that we need to concentrate on.
Dan and I are good friends, so we can. It has often bothered me that this goal of public facilities is those two words say there's so much included in that. And I think it's always been a detriment to rural areas the way that goal is thought about. Because to me, there are two issues that I would like to see brought forward in the comp plan that are just not common and easy to derive from the state mandated goals. And one of them is that, I echo exactly what you said about what climate change is doing to our facilities. And in rural areas, being Westerners, we have this feeling that if you live in a rural area you absolutely must be self-sufficient. Well, you know what? I think those days are over. Because if your septic system is poisoning your neighbor's well, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe there's a connection here that we need to start talking about. And I would encourage this group to be very creative. I think we could get it past the state. But to be very creative about talking about the really quite wonderful, innovative techniques that are used in other parts of the world for taking care of rural water and sewer issues. I would love to see it just be a very robust part of the comp plan, because there are innovative practices happening, and they're going to get better, but we have an incredible part of our county where rural folks live. And this water sewer issue is just enormous. And I'd love to see, nope, I'm not allowed to say I'd like to see the county spend money on something, but I think that we need to do some robust, innovative research. And to have the public sector help our rural residents with some of these issues. The other issue is the something that's not anywhere, I think, it is the issue that long ago and far away, I worked in one of the fastest growing counties in America. And we have to be very proactive in terms of what our municipal, local structures of government need to be. There are places in this county that are, to my mind, truly urbanizing. And we need to talk about creating some kind of municipal responsibilities in those places. We have recently had a couple of our special districts that provided tide gate and water issues just throw their hands up. They're volunteers, and they just said, "Whoop, we resign. We don't want to do this anymore." We've got to think about things like that in the future. We have to think about what kind of a stable municipal type of entity we need to be thinking, I think, anticipating where those are likely to happen in the county and start talking about it.
Right, so we have this bifurcation in the state, you're either urban or you're not. And, yeah.
You're in a UGB or you're out of the UGB.
Quasi place in there.
Exactly.
And also that if you're urban or rural, you can't get along.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know, tell me what you were going to say, and I'll tell you whether or not.
Well, I was going to say the same thing, so. I just wanted to share on the topic of alternative energy forms here and addressing the issue of PUC. I am a big proponent of using biomass to create energy, and I know it's a controversial topic and it has to do with the particulate matters. We're a particulate matter that's released into the atmosphere by doing so, and this is a 50-year plan, so technology is rapidly changing. So it's something to consider. There are communities in the Sierra Nevada mountain range of California that power their hospitals and their community college by using the scrap materials from harvesting products, and these are materials that help clean up forests and are, when we use mitigation measures for reducing fuels in forests, this is all the scrap stuff that's left behind that isn't harvested, that aren't, these ladder fuels that you hear of, they're usually diseased, and they don't have the capability of growing to maturity. All of that material can be used to produce energy. So hospitals are powered by that. So think about what we could do to partner with our local forestry groups already to create that source. And again, keeping in mind that technology probably will be changing for the better to reduce those particulate matter loads. Another thing that happened in the community that I lived in, addressing the PUC issue, was community choice aggregation. That might be a new term that people haven't heard yet, but it's a way to pull information in the community that the community says, these are important alternative forms of energy that we want to have access to. And our county could come up and develop, and cities can develop an aggregation plan that gets us off of a natural or these fossil fuel dependencies. And by demanding that working with the PUCs to develop these and encourage these alternative use of energy.
So I have a question for you regarding
Can you tell us anything about biochar?
I'm not hip on biochar, I'm not up to date on it. Yeah, but so the biochar is another thing, and that's something that's a resource that I have connections to, and that we're learning about. Oregon State Extension foresters are putting together a climate change series to really kind of wrap our brain around all of these things, and that's in process right now, and we hope to have some community engagement around some of those things too, to share some of that information, but that's something that I'm not up to date on. But I have access to it if anybody wants any information on it.
Yeah, my understanding, it's a way to make charcoal-like material out of that waste material. Yeah.
In the late 1990s, the state of Oregon spent nearly 5 years and many individuals to adjust the International Building Code to meet what Oregon would accept as legitimate building. Building types, as well as modern technologies, have to be looked at from the building code point of view. In 1995, that organization was presented composting toilet technology that, in my estimation, should move forward. It would easily take care of homes away from areas where we have sewer. And that building codes department needs to be in the loop with regard to what is acceptable building practices. And that is a big starting point with regard to not only residential, but commercial construction.
Great, okay. I have a couple things to say about that. First of all, the building codes are reviewed every 5 years, and they are up for review in the 2020 cycle. So maybe one of your comp plan policies could be to participate in that building code review cycle and bring up these issues. There are ways to bring up these issues. And the other thing I want to say, and this is a slight deviation, but there's a section in the building code about wildfire construction practices in wildfire areas. And in order for it to be used in building code, building permitting, it has to be adopted by the local community. So that would be another policy you might consider, is to go through the building codes and find those optional policies that need to be adopted locally in order to become effective. Back here and then you two.
Yes, I'm wondering if in coordination with the comp plan and in reference to biomass harvest and energy in general, if we couldn't somehow encourage the harvesting of invasives to use as biomass and to use for other purposes, to create paper, to all sorts of opportunities there by harvesting the things that are so much of a problem in our area.
I just want to note, just from the biomass perspective, I'm not an expert on that, I don't have an opinion on it, but already the large timber companies are burning huge piles of timber slash behind a lot of our houses, and that's why Arch Gable was burned down 2 years in a row. So, but I think one of the limitations is the expense moving that material to places that actually have the facilities. So it is getting burned already, and it is producing carbon, and maybe in the long term we can find some solution there. But you can also just drop and leave it, and it biodegrades much more slowly, which is what I did on my own personal timber property. But I wanted to just get to these last few that are blank. And so urbanization, one thing I'm hearing is something about limiting expansion of urban growth boundaries and urbanization to be outside of the natural hazard mapped areas, the current, and also keeping in mind potential future inundation zones due to sea level rise and increased storm events. Same for estuaries and coastal shorelands and beaches and dunes. And I did just the words, strategic retreat, we just need to keep talking about that, I think. That before any of these more extreme solutions like armoring go in, people have to make, and also municipalities have to make their best efforts to pull stuff back. And currently we're allowing, for example, in Arch Cape, we have a pretty good setback from the ocean for houses, but then we're allowing decks, as long as they're, I think, under 3 feet, to be built almost all the way out to the ocean front. And those decks are extra weight, and then also people want to protect them. So what's happening is and people are building illegal stairs and all sorts of other crazy stuff too, but that's pulling the cliffs down into the ocean much more quickly, and then people want to protect it, and so the armoring happens. So there's this kind of this snowball effect. So how do we really, before we get to those more heavy-handed things, how do we encourage strategic retreat and also not allow increased building in those setback areas that already exist?
Right. Okay, I had a question back here, there, and you.
I'm very much in agreement with most things people say, but not with burning slash for energy, because it damages the forest floor. And I would also love a county commitment to link the study of trees when they are optimal for carbon capture, so they can be grown for that, and then when we're ready, they can make money for growing for trees for that. And also the county to study what kinds of trees are both fire resistant and capture the most carbon and are adaptable here that do well.
Okay, so a potential, let's think about a potential comp plan action or goal or policy that could come out of that. Could it be something like partner with universities to blah, blah, blah? I think remember why we're here. I'm going to go here and then here.
I want to take this opportunity to jump to estuaries before it gets too late. A growing concern among our people is the invasive species that have been allowed to prosper in our estuaries that are don't allow conducive harmony to the fish and wildlife that require the lifeblood of the estuaries place. And I'll speak one word, and that's Spartina. Everyone in this room is driven by it every day that they drive the new highway bridge that goes between Astoria and Warrington. It's very visible, it smells. It degrades the shoreline, prevents the shorebirds from utilizing the shorelines, giving them protective cover during heavy storms and even during drought seasons. Also, the birds of prey are deprived of their resources in capturing their prey there because of the heavy, thick growth of Spartina. It's not native to this area. The state of Washington has done a wonderful job of eradicating the Spartina, or putting it in place in the Willapa Bay area. I don't know who the entity or who cares in the state of Oregon about the health of our estuary in Youngs Bay. Well, actually, all of our bay areas. But if it's not addressed, and it should be, our estuaries are going to fail. And right at this moment, we should really look at addressing the invasive species, particularly Spartina, and then all the rest of them that are not native. It definitely affects our culture. Our culture depends severely on sweetgrass, and I won't go into the great detail of the cultural need for sweetgrass, but doesn't affect you all, but it does greatly affect our cultures. And Spartina, the gift of Spartina in shipping crates from San Francisco to here has been nothing but a detriment to our culture. So if somebody knows who to get a hold of on the state level or county level or a combination of both, let's get the goddamn stuff out of here.
So there's the immediate action of getting in touch with people now, but then on the comp plan to address invasive species in estuaries. And I also mentioned that there is an estuary management plan here, and I don't know if it addresses invasive or species. Do you know? It needs to be updated in any case. So that would be something to add to the estuary management plan.
I appreciate those comments and like them. I'm a little sensitive about going backwards, but to me, the comments about alternative fuels, just something that we could build into the comp plan, ideas of these, private, public partnerships, discussions that would go on at Oregon State University involved, and some of it could just be an awareness of what we're doing now. I thought when biomass came up, it was interesting, as you might not have noticed that the white truck and trailer that came by, but that was biomass that actually was produced from our property this morning. And it's on its way to Wana right now to produce steam for both electricity and their manufacturing process. So some of this is occurring. It just has to do with capacities, efficiencies, emissions. I was literally at a workshop yesterday in Portland looking at the biomass plant that is been in place up in Kettle Falls, Washington. It produces it's a 50 megawatt power plant up there. Some of it was the challenges of the sourcing, so there's a lot involved with it. There's a lot of technology out there, and we just highlight, I think that's another place for our discussions to continue in collaboration. So writing that in would build that additional incentive to do it.
Okay. Someone over here? Okay. Did you want to say something?
A little bit to what he was saying about invasives. This is a climate change focused workshop. That's actually, I'm not sure if it was in anything earlier, but that is an issue that we should be concerned with, is that as the climate changes a little bit, that does provide a window for invasive species that may not be here currently to migrate here. A number of our native species are relatively well adapted for the type of changes we may see here in Clatsop County. We're pretty lucky that it's projected that if the world gets its act together and we keep the temperature change to the 1.5 to 2 degrees that we're aiming for, Clatsop County will be relatively, we'll get off easy comparatively. But especially the summer droughts may really give a window for some of those invasive species to move in, and it would be great to see in this comprehensive plan a 30-year or 50-year outlook about a response to when those species arrive, and kind of a rapid response to keep them from getting a foothold here.
All right.
I would like to counter all the talk about the burning of slash and other vegetation matter for power. That stuff is just, think of it as just juvenile coal, because it's just another form of carbon. And if you're burning it, you're adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and we shouldn't be going in that direction at all. We should be burning less carbon-based material for our energy. So I'd be totally opposed to using any of the so-called surplus material for producing power. It's a horrible idea. That material would best be ground up and put back on the forest floor where the carbon would be stored for longer, would improve the soils, would hold more moisture, would help in the whole hydrologic cycle, would allow plants to grow better there. So it's foolishness to talk about burning slash for power. Then one other element that I'd like to bring up quickly that the county has made some headway on, especially recently, is what to do with hazardous wastes. And this plays back into septic systems and large municipal wastewater treatment facilities. With the complex society we live in, we're producing all sorts of exotic chemicals, and many of them are pharmaceuticals.
Some of them are other organic substances. And our systems for handling those are not breaking those compounds down. And those compounds are making it right through our wastewater treatment facilities and certainly through septic systems. And then they get into the water systems that we're counting on for our supply, or they move into the natural water systems where they're affecting the biology of the organisms that live there. So you're getting all kinds of really bad effects from these compounds. So I would encourage more facilities around the county. We just opened one here at the Astoria transfer station for handling hazardous waste, but I think it's only open once a month. But what about the people out in Jewel? What about the people out in Napa where it's a hassle to come in to town for that? Maybe there could be portable facilities to go to these communities once in a while and retrieve this stuff and bring it back and process it in a way where it's better sequestered.
Yeah, so I have a suggestion here. Do you want to hear it? For the comp plan, which is that when regulations are made, or even at the permit level, that some sort of carbon accounting be done. That would be a county policy. Say that again? I'm just saying, if any time a regulation is made, that there is some attention paid to carbon accounting. Will this activity, whatever it is, whether it's development or a new waste treatment plant or whatever, or the encouraging the use of biomass, it would go through an accounting process to say, is this a net carbon remover or a net carbon emission, a carbon budget, right? Yeah, I have a question here and then I'll get to you.
I'd just like to make a comment on invasive species. I know some of the counties on the east side, they have weed boards. And if this county doesn't have one, okay, then make sure that it would be encompassing of the aquatic nature, because I do think that's very important here. But they could be a focal point for tracking the invasives and also help to prioritize which species are economically feasible to combat, because there is a point when invasive species become so common, it's like, like Scotch broom. Are you going to eradicate Scotch broom? That's just one example. But that's something that we should emphasize.
The Soil and Water Conservation District, which is a county-wide, their really entire program right now is dealing with noxious invasive species.
I just wanted to respond to your comment, because there are a lot of opinions about biomass, and that's why I mentioned, as technology comes along, there are ways to control what gets emitted into the atmosphere. We have technology that can address that. And I want to say, for the people who live in fire-prone communities, who they deal with a lot of smoke and see their communities burn down. So a lot of that carbon gets released in the form of catastrophic wildfires that are just so beyond control right now. And so this is a way to mitigate that and to take all of those fuels that create those conditions in our forests that create these catastrophic wildfires and to put it into a way that converts energy to their community. So those people who live in those communities, who live in those fire-prone communities, don't think that's a foolish system at all. It's actually a very smart system for dealing with the way to mitigate the impacts of extreme fire dangers in their communities. So that's the spirit that I wanted to bring forward with that. And there are going to be different opinions on that. There is alternative energy forms. And when we talk about production costs of solar energy, we don't have a lot of production here in the United States. The upstream costs of that is all there. The citizens of China and other places have to deal with that gunk, and that's in their own backyards, and we benefit from that other product. So let's think about the whole picture when we think about alternative energy sources.
Okay. All right, I see, did you want to say something?
Chris, while I agree with you that I personally don't like to see debris burned in the forest, the scientific laws indicate that the same amount of carbon is breaking down, laying on the forest floor as the same as if it were burned. Yes, it's a slower process, very definitely. But if the paper mill needs to produce steam, I would rather see that slash go and be turned into steam than them taking coal out of the ground and burning for the same heat. There are technologies that allow those kind of products to be burned much more cleanly. But you have to keep in mind that the same energy is trapped in that debris, no matter how it's disposed of.
Yeah, so it's pretty obvious that biomass is a conversation that needs to be had in this county.
It's a little bit different. I have two things. One, that we know that coastal forests are different than the forests in the eastern part of the state. And sometimes, I'm not saying you are, but sometimes they get that confused. And our coastal forests are very important to our water cycle here. But then the other thing, speaking about water, I was up in Bellingham a month or so ago in the art museum, and they had all their toilets flushed by water that they collected from the rain. It wasn't coming out of the city water system, which I thought was totally cool. And something like that is maybe something we can look at for different parts of our county.
Great. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left, and I know there are people who have been sitting here for 2 hours and 50 minutes who haven't said a thing. Do any of you want to say anything about any of these topics?
I'm Mary Kimmis, and I'm on the South County Advisory Council or Committee, and you guilted me into saying something, so I'm going to say something. And that is, I think the water catchment system is a great idea, remembering, however, that that water then is possibly not going into the ground, so it's not as straightforward as it might appear.
Anyone else that hasn't said anything?
Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and my wife and I own and operate Clatsop County's only organically certified farm. And we raise vegetables and chickens and for eggs. And, you know, I see a lot of things, the biochar, carbon sequestration in the forest, and, you know, really we're looking at a, circle of life here. So, you know, carbon sequestration can be increased by 3, 4, 5, 6 times depending on the health of the soil. So the health of the soil is the thing that I haven't heard anybody talk about as far as carbon sequestration goes. And
What leverage do we have in the comp plan for carbon sequestration?
well, in incentives to the I would much rather have an industrial forest landowner for a neighbor than I would have a bunch of houses. So I don't agree with all the industrial forest policies, but they have the greatest potential to sequester carbon. You know, the Earth is capable of removing all the carbon in the atmosphere right now and sequestering it in the ground. But you're not going to do that if the soil is poisoned by herbicides or pesticides. You know, and it's the same thing with the septic systems. You know, a septic system, if it's taken care of and the biology of it is kept healthy, you know, it will last virtually forever. But you got to be careful about what you put in it. And in the forest ecosystem, you know, to sequester the most carbon in the ground, you've got to be careful of what you do to that soil, because when you start killing off the microbes, and they are the key to healthy trees and clean water and carbon sequestration. So in the plan, I mean, I don't know what the has the capability of dictating, but some kind of incentive to, to pay attention to the systems of the earth that have been here for, tens of millions of years, that in 100 years we have totally disrupted. And this is why we are having the problems that we are today in a lot of different areas. So if, maybe under carbon sequestration or under, forestry practices, to, address the best means possible to take advantage of carbon sequestration, that would help us to, mitigate some of this damage that we have done and are continuing actually to do. And I think that's one of the things we're looking at today is what we can do to mitigate this. And, from my perspective as an organic farmer, we need to pay attention to the systems that the earth has always had in place and always have done a very good job. We've ignored those, and we are just beginning to pay the price. So thank you.
Yeah, so I heard a couple things. I heard education, partnerships, and incentives.
And research.
And research. That's where the partnerships come in. Yep. So those are things the county can encourage possibly through the comp plan process. Did I see a question over here? I want to get people who have not said anything, and then I'll get back to the people that have said things. Okay, very good.
You're waiting. Well, I'm from Columbia County, and I want to say you're very lucky to, I used to live here, and maybe I'll move back, I don't know. It's pretty cool. We don't have climate change in Columbia County, apparently. And I know I asked about our comp plan recently, and nobody could find it. I do think that what I see, and it won't be in a comp plan, but is making sure that your elected officials know what climate change is and are behind it. And it's amazing to me how we had this, as Greg mentioned, the anti-forum, and we had elected officials sitting in there laughing and joking, and whoo-hoo, yeah, it's great. And that's frightening to me, because they're making decisions about the Columbia River, about my family, my land, my animals, and that's just frightening. So I just want to say, my only other exposure was 100 years ago, I was in graduate school, and I was taking a geology class, and they brought us to Clatsop County, and they said, take a look around, because it's all going to be gone. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm moving, I'm leaving. But anyway, thank you. This has been very enlightening for me as a citizen activist, and we're going to probably go back and try once again asking, I remember once asking, well, what is your opinion on gun safety? And if they said what I didn't like, then we didn't vote for them. We didn't, it can work that way. And I know on a national level it's kind of tricky at this point, but I hope that we will come up to be like Clatsop County.
All right.
Is there a sign-up sheet? I would love it if you could have an outreach to people at this meeting, if that's not too difficult, to have a comment thing where they just informally say, yeah, I love this meeting, I get these emails sometimes, yeah, great meeting, this is input, this is my comment.
Talk about next steps in the 2 minutes we have left. So I will work with Gail to write up some notes from this meeting. There's a lot of content that was put forth in these last 3 hours, and it's going to take some effort to do that, but we'll capture that. Is that true? Yes. Yep. Okay. I know I would do it, but I hope Gail would help.
Write up some notes.
Yeah, right. Okay. So yes, your comment is well taken, that then those notes should be circulated and a way to supplement and riff off the ideas that we talked about.
So I actually wanted to follow up with Gail and just see if you could talk about, okay, so we're on a 4-month break until April, right, for the committees? 3 months now. 3 months now. And so there's a lot of people in this room on those committees, so so I want to know, like, how this is going to get integrated. And also, one thing that's from this workshop, but from other ones, it seems like there may be a place for sort of county-wide goals that apply to all the, rather than having each area have the exact same thing or something almost the same, having like county-wide goals.
That's called the comprehensive plan.
Okay, but then there's the sub, but then there's.
As part of that, there are community plans.
Right, okay.
That are tailored to your planning area. So
Right.
the comp plan is the countywide goal. Everything should be consistent countywide. Now, if you want to go in Southwest and do something a little bit above and beyond, that's still consistent with that, you can.
Okay, so those
Policy that would contradict with.
right, those statements though that have been coming out of the committees, are those going to be part of the community plans or the whole count plan?
We are reviewing the goals right now, so that's going into the countywide comp plan. When we get done with the countywide, the 18 goals, then we're going to start the community plans. And that's really where the different planning areas are going to diverge in their discussions. So, yeah, did that answer your question there?
Right. So those statements that are coming out, they'll be in the comp plan. And then there'll be future conversations that might be, okay, this is what the comp plan's goals are, but we want our communities to have a little bit extra.
That's just part of the update, but right now we're focused on the goals that are countywide.
And so these would be countywide.
These are countywide goals, yes. Okay.
All right, so I want to thank you all for a very civil and interesting conversation. No, it was great. And you're... And I hope you'll keep bringing the ideas forward. Spurred some thinking.
Thank you. And thank the planning department also. So please, again, if you have not signed the sign-in sheet, please do so.
Thank you so much.
And we have live streamed the meeting today, and it's been recorded. So when it's posted on the website, I will email a link to it.